La Vita Italiana nel Risorgimento 1849-1861 quarter, Serie I, Storia Federation e Unite by Ernesto Italian Life during the Resurgence 1849-1861, Serie V. History, Federation and Unity. The Heroes of the Revolution, Francesco S. Nitti from the 10 days of Brescia to the Battle of San Martino, Pompeo, Molmenti, the Kindly King, Domenico Oliva, publishers, Bemperad, Figlio, Florence, 1901, all literary rights reserved. Unauthorized reproduction prohibited. The publishers, Bemperad, Figlio, declare all copies without the following signature to be counterfeit illustration, handwritten signature Florence. 1901, Florentine Printing House, V.S. Gallo 33 Federation and Unity Conference of Massey on February 18, 1861. For the first time, the Parliament of Italy gathered in Turin, almost all free and united, as Vittorio Emanuele loudly declared, and I still hear those words and the enthusiastic roar with which they were received in my ear and heart. A few days later, on March 17, 1861, a single article law was promulgated. King Vittorio Emanuele I assumes for himself and his successors the title of King of Italy. In presenting the draft to the deputies, Count Cava wrote in the preceding report, "A great deed has been accomplished, a new era begins." And parliamentary reporter Giambattista Giugini said, "There are oases in the deserts of history." He declared, "There are in the life of nations solemn moments that could be called the poetry of history, moments of triumph and ecstasy, when the soul, absorbed in the present, shuts out regrets from the past and worries about the future. Let us render justice. All of us sitting here have worked differently for the same cause. All of us have contributed our stone to this great edifice, under which future generations will rest. Here, the volunteers of Calata Fimi could show us the glorious scars on their chests. Here, the prisoners of Sant Elmo, the coluses around their wrists from heavy chains. Here, with greying hair and early wrinkles. Orators, writers, apostles of that faith that made soldiers and martyrs. Here, the generals who won our battles. Here, the statesmen who governed our policies. Therefore, let a unanimous cry of enthusiasm rise from here, and let it be heard throughout the nations. I am Italy. This grandiloquent emphasis was fitting at the time. Now it seems to read like one of Petrarch's familiar letters, and also, unusually for then, completely accurate. The great and novel event in our history, the supreme joy felt by everyone, from the king to the last peasant, the presence of all the key figures who had contributed to this in so many different ways. They were all really there. The only absence notable was that of Garibaldi and Mazzini. Porfirio, a long-time opponent of Count Cava, emphasized this absence, accusing him of usurping an initiative that should have belonged entirely to the popular representation. Cava felt the blow and parried it fiercely. "Oh, well, Italians," he replied, "have taken part in our great drama of resurrection, but I am allowed to say and proclaim with deep conviction that in recent events the initiative was taken by the government of the king. It was the government that took the initiative for the Crimean campaign. It was the government, the king, which took the initiative to proclaim Italy's right at the Paris Congress. It was the government of the king that took the initiative for the great acts of 1859, through which Italy constituted itself. Therefore, he concluded, in other words, even the initiative to proclaim national unity belongs to government of the king. And why not? Was Count Cava perhaps boasting? Without those initiatives, all his note that he remained silent about the Marchi and Umbria campaigns, Garibaldi's enterprise in Sicily and Naples, would never have been possible. There is no doubt about national unity. Mazzini had been its oldest and most persistent apostle, and thus he was also a great contributing factor to what was happening now. But who could seriously compare Count Cavour's work with Mazzini's attempts from 1833 onwards? Except that the radical ultra-democratic party, of which Porfirio was at that time the interpreter, had always misunderstood Count Cavour so much as to consider him guilty of being Unitarian not by choice, but because, first and foremost, a Piedmontese and monarchist, he exploited others' work for the benefit of the ancient dynastic policy of the Cassio artichoke, and hastened the annexations and Italian unity with the zeal of a neophyte, a last-minute convert, someone illuminated by a sudden ray of sunlight on the road to Damascus. If this was said or written in good faith, which many are entitled to doubt, it is foolish and insensitive to the highest degree, and does not deserve any other response than the one I myself, from here in Rogero Bongi, give to a progressive Republican-minded who thought, friend, he had found a killer argument against Count Cavour. We were walking through a countryside in high summer after much discussion. In short, said that person, but believed in Italian unity from 1832. But Count Cavour did not. So who was right in the end? Listen, replied Bongi. At this moment you say, believe it's snowing. You are obviously wrong. But if you keep saying it until winter comes and it does snow and you want to boast see, I was right. You're saying something else, and that makes two of them. That's enough for today. This is precisely how it is, and leaving aside what Count Cavour may have thought or believed in his youth, why would he have been a Unitarian or Federalist the day after Novara? Who could have known what would happen after that immense ruin of 1848 and 49? What doctrine had survived? Which political party hadn't been defeated, even though everyone had tried? The greatest quality, the true originality of Count Cavour lies precisely in his full freedom of spirit when he undertook the Italian enterprise. No tradition bothered him. No sectarian commitment hindered him. No old doctrine dominated his thoughts. He deeply felt the immense misery of Italian life. Perhaps he didn't realize the full extent of the damage. Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name Ernesto. 3 centuries of servitude had molded our character, allowing him to act more openly, securely and efficiently than anyone else. His education was primarily in English and French. All his travels were abroad. Italy was almost a foreign concept to him, yet it dominated every thought. This, I would argue, benefited him greatly. Much of Massimo de Ziglio's uncertainty, having lived in Rome, Florence, Milan, and Naples, stemmed from knowing Italians too well. The Count of Cavour's bold confidence in understanding them came from, knowing them. Even Garibaldi noticed this. It is not a compliment to Italians, but day by day I believe it becomes more and more true. For this reason, the Count of Cavour was an extraordinary figure among Italians. Not only was his mind powerful, setting him apart from all others, there were other men with immensely powerful minds, superior in some ways to Cavour's, who did not lack in Italy. But the very essence of his mental organization, the form of his education, his tendencies, the disposition of his spirit, the way he grasps, examines, and solves every problem that arises, all this was fundamentally different from even the most distinguished wish varieties of Italian intellect, making the Count of Cavour a phenomenon. It made him late to the political scene. During his youth and the revolution of 1848-49, he remained somewhat distant, despite the profound clarity of his ideas and the forms in which he expressed them. For a long time, political opponents, and even some friends, saw him as an enigma, seeking countless absurd explanations. They labelled him an Anglophile Porphyrio, and his companions called him Lord Caver, or a reactionary, or a municipalist. Even among the aristocracy from which he came, they initially judged him a murky and unconventional mind, a late Jacobin at court, and among the sceptical liberal bourgeoisie of Piedmont, who had many claims to make, a suspicious figure to be quarantined. Vincenzo Gioberti, his former political opponent, was the first to accurately foresee and predict him, as evidenced by these words from Civil Renewal written in 1851. That zest, that vigor, that activity captivate me, and I admire the same noble mistake of treating a province as if it were a nation, compared to the dithering of those who had a nation in mind like a province. I consider him one of the most capable men, from an intellectual standpoint, to assist the prince in the work I am speaking of. But what kind of intellect was Gioberti referring to? For this is a generic quality of intellect that even those who fundamentally miss every mark are not always lacking, and those who are sad often have it in abundance. And as for this generic quality of intellect, no one has described it with more finesse than Isaac Artem, one of his most modest and intimate collaborators. He never set himself a fictitious goal, wrote Artem, but always strove to achieve what was possible. He was inaccessible, yet he never settled for achieving less than possible. His gaze never strayed beyond the boundaries of reality, but reality was, for his genius, an even vaster horizon that lay beyond what other men could comprehend. God sent us, O Lord. Count Caver, let's say it, at the cost of paying 50 cents to Rabagas, as in Sardou's play God Sent Us, Count Caver precisely, because the Italian Revolution would no longer get lost in endless prior musings about monarchy and republic, historical traditions and literary prophecies. Federation and unity, but would emerge from all the old ruts into which it had stumbled so many times, finally emerging from a state of catatonia for fanatics and solitaires and entering a period of genuine reality, relying on what was possible and even daring at the right moment, but no longer talking about millions of armed men bursting out of the ground or catastrophes that would submerge half the world, or vague idealism so at odds with everything around us that it made us feel perpetually intoxicated and in a trance, striking their heads against every corner of the wall, or metastation heroes cutting the air with their swords but relying only on the mercy of the stars. Do you think it would have taken much to convince millions of Arcadians and illiterates in Italy to make such a transition from the realm of dreams to reality 14 years later? When Count Caver inaugurated that policy of national hegemony in Piedmont that made Italy, was there not an element of flexibility in his mind beforehand? For radicals and ultra-democrats, this constituted his great disadvantage compared to them, but it was instead his originality and strength. He loved his country with passion, and two things he held as certain: the impotence of doctrinaire reformism and Mazzini's revolutionary ideology, and the need for Piedmont to rise so high in European public opinion that it could harness the revolution to its own political advantage and negotiate on equal terms with diplomacy, despite the fact that the goal of Piedmontese politics was to tear up its treaties in their faces and overturn all of those post-1815 arrangements. With a madness no less insufferable than that of professional revolutionaries, they had been willing to believe in their perpetuity. One thing, however, always seemed clear to me: he, like King Charles Albert and Cesare Balbo considered one thing as absolute, the need to expel Austria from Italy. As for the Unification program, it's not true that he completely rejected it. In 1856, he met Daniel Manin in Paris, who presented him with his new program, Independence, Unity, and the House of Savoy. He found it somewhat utopian, but already the significant moral and political achievements he had been able to secure at the Paris Congress had broadened his horizons so much that, in the same year, during a secret conversation with La Farina, who was closely allied with Manin, here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Ernesto with Palavra, and then with Garibaldi. He sought to establish a national society based on that program to replace young Italy by Mazzini. I have faith, he said to him, that Italy will become a single state with Rome as its capital, but I do not know if it is ready for this great transformation. Establish the national society. If the Italians prove mature for unity, I hope that the opportunity will not be long in coming. But beware that none of my political friends believes in the possibility of the venture. Come to me whenever you want, but before daybreak and without anyone seeing or knowing. If he were questioned in Parliament and by diplomacy, he would deny it as Peter did and say, I do not know him. Thus he too became a conspirator. He had all his cards ready, and against his usual nature he boasted of having conspired with the National Society in his second great speech on Rome as a capital. In Piedmont, as a legally permitted association, the National Society was public, secret elsewhere in Italy. It did not adopt any of the forms of ancient sects, nor impose any other moral constraints on its adherents besides accepting the program, Independence, Unity, and the House of Savoy. And what would have been the outcome for Italy if he had refused? In any case, from an impossible project of confederation emerged Magenta and San Martino, and from a war poorly concluded at Villafranca came Italian unity. But not only his opponents, but many others say, no, political unity in Italy was achieved despite Count Cavour, and it was achieved because unity was the great, true, unique tradition of all Italian history. I do not know if Count Cavour, but we all, from the most to the least, have fallen into this error. We all, from the most to the least, are guilty of burning a few grains of incense to this falsehood. There was then another school, Catholic, liberal or rationalist and Republican, which claimed in Italian history to find the federal tradition. We do not blame anyone. Indeed, it might be a patriotic merit. Who could have studied Italian history before 1859 without a political subtext? And this subtext should not have been the program of one's party, for there is indeed my historical truth, but unfortunately there can also be many subjective interpretations, as many historians as there are. God forbid I should say that with history in hand one could equally prove both yes and no. Surely it is true that in the vast arsenal of historical facts one can find arguments for every cause, offensive and defensive weapons for all parties, and it would be easy to cite examples, especially among the writers of our contemporary history, both Italian and foreign. So there is a rhetoric of facts, and depending on how they are grouped and presented, one might sometimes believe that two stories with diametrically opposed spirits could be written on identical documents. And it would give reason to Benjamin Constant when he said, I have 10, 20, 40,000 facts, and I can use them as I please. Do you find this skepticism? No, sir. It is using our reason, for God has given us reason And starting from this wise skepticism, a great English writer notes that modern civilization has been able to correct, at least in part, those three fundamental errors that in the past made us so careless in politics, so naive in science, and so intolerant in religion. In our case, there is actually no unified tradition or federal tradition in Italian history, at least until the end of the 18th century. But here are those who cite you often borrowing ideas from afar, pointing to the elongated shape of the peninsula, the variety of races that inhabited it as soon as it became habitable, their different natures and customs, all indications repugnant to unity, the ancient Italian federations prior to Rome, which resisted her conquest for so long, the typical experiment, namely the first cornerstone of federal tradition. And here are others who counter, not without reason, that these ethnographical and moral arguments prove nothing, as there are many other unitary nations that could be cited, and that the peninsula, surrounded by the sea and the Alps, compensates widely with the solid certainty of its borders for the dangers of its configuration. As for the first Italian federations, surrounded as they were by nomadic and savage peoples, if they ever expressed anything, it was rather a crude tendency towards unity, which was actually fulfilled with the formation of the Roman state. But why, then, can one not say that ancient Rome, classical Rome, was a unitary state in the sense we understand today? From the beginning, Rome had to fight much harder to conquer Italy than all the rest of its empire. Second, Italian cities were all subject to her in various degrees, with different forms, and held in check by a system of colonies that gradually expanded, always with the dual purpose of preventing rebellion and defending the dominant city. So there was no federation or unity, but pure subjection, against which numerous and terrible rebellions took place, and I challenge anyone to deny, as unitary proponents often do, that the social wars from 90 to 60 BC did not express a separatist tendency, subdued only by a gradual move towards dictatorship. As for the empire, it is no longer Rome, but universal domination of the world, and if when the empire dissolved, the fact remains that the large dioceses in which was divided became the nucleus around which other modern nations were composed through slow work. It is not true that in the Diocese of Italy itself this fact did not occur, because the kingdom that the barbarians founded made them kings in Italy, but not kings of Italy. The Italians, always lost behind the vain phantom of Roman cosmopolitanism, never allowed this kingdom to unify them, as happened elsewhere, where the two races, the indigenous and the invaders, blended perfectly into one. In Italy, instead, the two races still contrast each other in the age of the communes, represented, though not always clearly or with distant causes, by feudal lords of castles and by the people of the commune, and within the commune itself by nobles and the people. For this reason, neither the Goths nor the Lombards had ever a moment's rest. For this reason, Leo I crowned Charlemagne in Rome to prevent a kingdom of Italy from arising and a unifying state from emerging. There was indeed a southern kingdom, but foreign in origin, feudal in character, with no connection to Roman traditions. It resembles the great states that were forming in Europe at the time, and therefore had no impact on Italy's structure during the Middle Ages. It served only to be opposed by the Pope to the Emperor, or vice versa, until it became the title and legal pretext for foreign invasions, shaping Italy's modern history from Charles V onward until Garibaldi drove it away. No part of Italy ever assimilated. Frederick I King of Puglia and Sicily, was not in Tuscany or Lombardy unless he was the emperor, head of the Ghibelline party. Thus Manfred Charles and Robert of Anjou in Tuscany, Romagna, and Piedmont never founded anything of their own. They were merely party leaders, fighting for the church and empire, joining the fragmented system of Italian cities system with no unity or federation, and sometimes not even true papist Gulfism or imperial Ghibelline spirit, despite the absence of the emperor and the disarmed pope. It unfolded with such glory, strength, and power that it created a great national civilization without parallel in the world at that time or for centuries after. We have forgotten too much, smothering this true Italian tradition under a formal, canonical, and bureaucratic unity that brought us nothing but trouble, devoid of any of the great, fertile energies of a strong, unified state. The fragmentation is even greater during the age of principalities and not compensated by operational virtue or virtual glory. If there was never a unitary tradition in the age of cities or principalities, can we point to any sign of a true federal tradition? One might still cite the Oath of Pontida for the age of cities, while the Lombard League existed it, but then it did not prelude to any stable federation. Instead, it led the temporary league of many cities, and after that. Here is the translation of the text preserving the name Ernesto. What about the victory at Legnano at the Congress of Venice, where the Pope, as the head of the League, abandoned his allies immediately, thinking only of himself and peace in Constance, when cities recognized the rights of the Roman Emperor and used the new franchises to tear themselves apart even more? Will anyone still remember the balance of Lorenzo the Magnificent, which was merely a political artifice of a great statesman, but rested solely on his shrewd skill and vanished with him? No, there has never been a true, stable, organized national federation in Italy, neither in the era of communes nor in that of principalities. There were indeed alliances in the commune period, such as Umbrian, Tuscan, and Lombard leagues, always formed for specific purposes and often dissolved before achieving their goals. Other alliances existed during the principality era, but interest, defection, or betrayal dissolved them all. One should not be deceived by illusions in Italy either, which appear from time to time. For example, in the 16th century, one might think Italy is about to organize under a single French monarchy or the Cambrai Federation, but the illusion disappears quickly. Can there be political unity under the hand of a foreign king, or a federation of foreigners and Italians against the glorious Republic of Venice? No. Regardless of efforts, if one searches for unitary federal traditions in Italian history before the French Revolution, all that is found are the immediate or remote causes of foreign preponderance. One should also not be misled by many writers, statesmen, diplomats, soldiers, even popes such as Julius I, Clement Paul, who always speak of Italy's freedom. For everyone not wanting to blame them for what is largely a matter of time, freedom for Italy does not mean Italy itself, nor unity or federation, nor free from foreigners, but rather that no foreign power prevails over another, and under this concept lies another particularism that matters even more to the best patriots, the most elevated spirits of this or that region. Whether Florence is free, or Milan is free, or the Papal State is not at the mercy of either foreigners or Italians. Above all, it is that no Italian state, due to its own strength or alliances, prevails over others, so when Venice's ambitions turn towards the mainland, no foreign power seems more threatening than her to what is known as freedom for Italy, and no preponderance is more feared or opposed. Furthermore, in the era of states, there is not a single tradition of unity or federation, but nor is there any independent politics from each state. The politics of each one are according to circumstances and times. French, Spanish, Austrian, and the Italian people even lose all consciousness of their own identity. Italy, which has such strong and distinct signs of national individuality, itself long before Metternich said it was reduced in the era of states to a mere geographical expression. This division of Italy, which was once almost 80 states reduced to 10 after the succession wars and the peace of Aachen, and not certainly by Italians but by foreigners, this national division remembers nothing, represents nothing. Speaking only of Tuscany, Giorgini wrote in 1861, I know Florentine, Sienese peasant traditions, but I do not know Tuscan humiliations and miseries. The same could be said, perhaps with more reason, of the rest of Italy. And to conclude, it is worth noting that all those who dig into unitary and federal traditions in Italian history have unwillingly fallen into this peculiar blind spot. While they believe they are pointing out the intermittent and broken traces of one or the other concept, they do nothing but list, more or less completely, the causes, great or small, for which neither unity nor federation has ever been possible, unless, beaten on the ground of facts, they take refuge in the visions of thinkers, in the prophecies of poets, or try to pass off as at least a principle of national unification the ambitions of some prince who, taking advantage of favorable contingencies, wanted to enlarge his state. As for the visions of thinkers and the prophecies of poets, the fact is true, and certainly helped keep alive a glimmer of national sentiment, if not in some small literary circle, but placed each one back in their own time, do they truly have the meaning usually attributed to them? Or what wonder that enlightened minds and spirits surpass the reality surrounding them and fly towards the inapplicable utopia or prophecies that do not come true? Can this fact alone constitute a historical tradition? For Dana Alighieri, Italian unity is the unity of the restored empire, unity of supreme jurisdiction, not state unity, from which it is difficult to infer that the mysterious Veltro he prophesied could have resembled little or much first Napoleon, then Pio VI, and finally Vittorio Emanuele or Garibaldi. But Dante's of his time and must be considered in his time, even if the divine poem is and will for forever be the national Bible for Italians. In fact, he had perhaps the first true consciousness of an Italian nationality. He had it because he composed, one might say, the unity of the Italian language, because he showed the importance of ethnographic and civil community of our linguistic commonality with the line, the beautiful country where yes sounds, including Sicily and Trentino, because finally the peninsula was described by him within its precise geographical boundaries. But outside of this, and referring to his political concept, he invokes the descent of an emperor who will bring back peace, imperial peace, which means universal peace, in which perhaps he sketched a thought of human brotherhood. His great ideal is peace. It is always political discord that he condemns, and he thinks they would cease if the emperor returned to his Rome. When he sighs for the coming of Henry VI, Dante knows well that this will not come to make Italian unity. There are even those who have believed that hoped for a confederation on such an occasion. I do not think so. He neither hoped nor wanted the unification of Italy, and here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto Pace so much that He advises nothing else to peoples and princes, and the only means to maintain it is for him the recognition of the rights of the empire. Dante indeed asserts Italian nationality, but does not discuss the political order of the nation. For him, Rome is the seat of the empire. Universal monarchy is necessary as established by God for the peace of the world, without which man cannot attain his end and eternal bliss. Furthermore, that monarchy is for him the continuation and perfection of the Roman Empire. Thus Dante's in his ideas and in his time. The same can be said of Petrarca, who, amidst the anarchy of tribunes, lords, and condottieri, through which he is condemned to wander all his life, does not at all specify his political system, because his hopes shift from Cole di Rienzi to Emperor Charles Iv, from Robert of Anjou to Lucchino and Galizio Visconti, and when all his idols have failed, he too ends up in the idyllic ego crying out peace. Peace, peace, the most useless counsel to give to the descendants of Abel and Cain. Who can deny that such great men, returning to themselves, abandoning themselves to their aspirations and speculations, do not contemplate and prophesy ideals of redeeming their homeland superior to those of all their contemporaries? But from this to linking them with what has happened in our time is a leap, and through arbitrary and anachronistic interpretations, one risks misunderstanding and distorting them entirely. Machiavelli is certainly more modern, but even he goes too far, violating the genuine sense of contemporary events when he asserts that for the sake of achieving Italian unity, he would have perhaps accepted Valentino Borgia as King of Italy. Read Villari's book, and you will see that for Machiavelli, Valentino Borgia is not the historical figure who must achieve Italian unity, but rather the type that inspires him with the concept, a concept that will dominate all his writings throughout his life. It is a separate and independent science of statecraft, detached from any moral consideration. Thus, Machiavelli makes Valentino a mythical character, but judges the real Borgia as he deserves, calling him a knave and a son of Pope Alexander, whom he also judges. So much so Machiavelli, who was then in Rome, barely notices the humiliating defeat of Valentino in Rome. In conclusion, as we're just emerging from medieval anarchy, the unity he aims for is that of the state, not the nation. Therefore, his Delenda Carthago Carthage must be destroyed, our feudalism, mercenary soldiers, the political power of guild corporations, the temporal dominion of popes, and their interference in the state, which he rightly sees as an insurmountable obstacle to Italian unity. In this sense, if one wants, Machiavelli is a prophet in that the organic unity of a state will bring Italian unity, and a state opposed to the Pope, free from his interference. Not the one on which, like the kingdom in Naples, the Pope exercises feudal jurisdiction and has always used it to throw it in the face of anyone who even hints at an Italian enterprise. Later, when Eustachio Manfredi, at the birth of a son of Amidio I of Savoy, sang in a sonnet, Italy, Italy, your aid is born, and Traiano Boccolini and Alessandro Tassoni wrote with patriotic sentiment against Spanish tyranny. This sentiment echoes in the verses of Fulvio Testi, Filicaia, and many others. It stands well and rightly deserves our praise and gratitude. But do we see in this the forerunners of Italian unity achieved between 1860 and 1870? Far from it. I don't see them in the ambitions of any lord or prince who tried to expand their dominion or principality in Italy. Mastino della Scala advanced from Verona nearly to the gates of Florence, but there he was stopped by the united forces of Florence and Venice, and his house's full power played out in this endeavour. Giangaleazzo Visconti seemed on the verge of becoming master of almost all of Italy, but when he confronted Florence, a sudden death removed this terrible enemy from the glorious city. Ladislao of Naples attempted the same thing, and a most opportune death ended for him as well, which caused Machiavelli to say, "Death was always a truer friend to the Florentines than any other friend, and more powerful in saving them than any virtue of theirs, regardless. And these endeavours do not prove or disprove the unitary or federal tradition." This is something quite different from Valentino Borgia. The French novel by Blanquet even has a fitting title, Roi di Toli. But what does he essentially want? He aims to establish the Borgia dynasty in a kingdom of central Italy and perhaps make the papacy hereditary. The plan was grand, I don't deny that. It was the final perfectioning of papal political nepotism, but it was too much in opposition to the very constitution of the papacy and to the conditions of Italy to ever succeed, despite the diabolic energy and lack of scruples of both the Pope and Duke Valentino, who sought to implement it. The House of Savoy remains, whose fortune ambition up to Emmanuel Filiberto, who established the capital in Turin. We do not know which side of the Alps it will lean towards. Subsequently, it is already a lot that it can balance with singular skill and courage between France and Spain, and between the two contending parties, expanding itself. The strongest indication of its future destiny lies in the grandeur of its plans and intentions, and almost in the disproportion between these and its forces and the extent of its territory. But more than anything, it is having arms in hand and always using the military valor and the close union between princes and people, so that the predictions of thinkers, statesmen, and poets, and the oracles that predict your lineage from the native Alps must descend with the years and Po River begin to come true for it. Here is the translation, while preserving the name Ernesto, to wait for a national consciousness dormant for 3 centuries of servitude to be revitalized throughout all Italian people. And for the Napoleon meteors to pass, we must until after Piemonte, having been swept away by the reaction, experiences and X that stirs in Carlo Alberto, the mysterious Amleto of vengeance. We must wait until the Italian Revolution unfolds, and through the insurrections of 1820 and 1821, it irrevocably establishes the rivalry between the 2 Italian monarchies and definitively resolves that the direction of the revolution should come from the north rather than the south of the peninsula. Only then will this extraordinary event occur. Italy itself, twice over, offers itself to the Savoys in 1831 through Giuseppe Mazzini, a unified republican who declares his willingness to sacrifice the republic if Carlo Alberto achieves Italian unity, saying, on these terms, we are all with you, otherwise, no. In 1856, through Daniel Manon, a federal republican renouncing both the federation and the republic, tells Vittorio Emanuele in the same words, achieve Italian unity, and we are all with you, otherwise, nope. I conclude my speech. In Italy's history prior to the French Revolution, there is neither tradition nor unity nor federation. National consciousness itself had faded into servitude, and it was revitalized by the French Revolution, preceded in Italy by the philosophical movement that stirred thoughts and feelings, especially among the upper and middle classes. To mention just one example of its widely felt impact, Parini's work and the moral tone of his satire renewed the man, while Alfieri's play and the stir of rebellion evoked a homeland and freedom for this man, already renewed within himself. These are indeed the true forerunners. The shock that Italy experiences from French invasion in 1796 is abrupt and violent, provoking fierce and bloody reactions among the peasantry. But thanks to it, the Italian Revolution begins, and after countless twists and turns, both happy and unhappy, it does not stop until its complete triumph 4 years later. Following Bonaparte's remarkable victories, if moving from the Congress of Modena and Reggio in 1796 towards the Cisalpine Federation, you transition to the parliaments of Cisalpina and the Lion Constituent Assembly, from which emerges for the first time in centuries a state named Italy, a continuous ascent, as the editors of the Cisalpine Acts express it, towards the ideal of united homeland. However, for French Republicans, Italy is only a conquest to be exploited. Then arises Augusto Franchetti, astutely notes between the universal redemption, promises of philosophy and the thief, actions of the invaders, between the declaration of human rights and their implementation in Italy by the French, which for the first time creates an opinion in Italy. This opinion spreads first among the most enlightened minds, then throughout all classes of citizenship, that we must no longer meander behind universal concepts like the church, empire, and now democratic republic, but embrace a new understanding. The story of the Italians was a continuous Holocaust, but finally to think that we too might have a united and independent homeland from strangers. To achieve this end, opposing unitary and federal systems emerged in political literature. Secret societies and subsequent revolutionary movements in 1815, 2018, 1801, 1845, 1848, and 1849. If one wishes to preserve a unitary or federal tradition in Italian history, it begins after the French invasion of 1796, and through the diligent efforts of many excellent writers, primarily Augusto Franchetti and Carlo Tiveroni. All the most minute details, both in monarchic and republican, were noted and collected from sources beyond great political literature that preceded and accompanied our revolutionary attempts. However, these unitary and federal systems did not extend beyond books, pamphlets, or individual inspirations of patriots and poets. The only practical application of a monarchic unity system was the Napoleonic kingdom, but it remained incomplete and dependent on strangers. Nevertheless, it rekindled in us a sense of a great and orderly governing body, revived military virtues and habits that had faded everywhere except in Piedmont, and the memories of that brief Italian redemption dream did not perish. As for the federal system, the closest experiment to reality was the 1848 revolution, but it could never go beyond establishing a customs union between Rome, Piedmont, and Tuscany. Meanwhile, the political federation, with permanent diet in Rome under the presidency of the Pope, faltered through vain attempts, projects, and negotiations without conclusion. From the liberal ministries of Pius X to Rosmini's mission to Rome, Alfieri's ministry in Piedmont, Vincenzo Gaioberti's federally promoted Congress in Turin, and Pellegrino Rossi's ministry. The final dissolution of the monarchic federal system occurred when Rosmini, who had already outlined a confederation design, where the Diet resident in Rome was tasked with declaring war, thus addressing the scruples that led to Pius X's ex-defection, was disavowed by the Piedmontese ministry in order to seek only the contingent the Pope could offer for the war. Rosmini refused to make such a request, but old suspicions of Piedmontese ambition were reignited in Rome's court and among the Pope, and every idea of federation vanished. The Pellegrino Rossi attempted to revive it upon becoming Pius X minister, but stood firm on the idea that war should not be resumed at that time, and that help from the King of Naples was indispensable, daring to include him in the projector significant factor contributing to his tragic end. Rosmini, though fully aware of his defeat, accompanied the Pope to Gaeta and endured the persecution he faced there, as well as the cowardly abandonment by Pius X. This is one of the most disgraceful scandals from the reaction that had already begun. Thus, the monarchic federal system came to an end forever. The federalist monarchy did not enjoy much longer success. The Mazzini Republican unitary system. To him, a triumvir in Rome in 1849, even if he thought about implementing it, time ran out, and even if he had been able to overcome the repulsions of Guerrazzi in Tuscany, those of Manin in Venice, and the fact that Charles Albert and his faithful Piedmont were already back on their own against Austria, the urgent need to defend Rome against the French did not allow him to even attempt it. Yet the Republic in Rome had fallen so gloriously that a bit of this glory gave new vigor to Mazzini's program. However, liberty maintained in Piedmont after Novara and the futile attempts of 1853, which led to many abandonments of the incorrigible apostle, also marked the final liquidation of the Republican unitary system. There is little need to speak about the Republican federal system, as it was nothing but the fantasy of a few solitaires, such as Cattaneo, Jute, Zeppi Ferrari, and a few others in their great intellectual genius. This arrangement seemed more suitable to the national character in the classic city, state land, or more capable of ensuring at least modest happiness for the peoples. A dream. What another. All of this was opposed by a Piedmontese hegemony, which could have only one outcome at either the end of Italy or national unity under the Savoy monarchy. According to this concept, implemented with unprecedented audacity, fortune, and intellect by Count Cavour, Italians united precisely because it was new, precisely because it was in direct contrast with all past history, precisely because all rival forms had been eliminated. There remained only the possible. The triumph of a revolution is achieved only by bending through persuasion or dominating with the strength of numbers, the undisciplined energies that, when dispersed, can do little or nothing and become irresistible only when persuaded or forced. They form a group and all impel at once in the same direction. This was the case in England in 1688, France in 1789, Italy in 1859-1860. Before such a new spectacle, the Republican Federalist Giuseppe Ferrari, deputy to the first Italian Parliament and a historian of the secular and relentless Italian antagonisms, looking around and seeing that strange variety of people from so many old schools and political parties who were about to proclaim Italian unity in 1860, warned his colleagues, be careful. They might very well be victims of a fatal illusion, about to commit a grave error that would lead them all to God knows what disasters. Marco Minghetti, also recent convert to unity, replied that perhaps Ferrari still believed it was the time of the Guelphs and Ghibelline Viscontis, the Sforzas, or Duke Valentino. And in truth, the illustrious historian resembled one of those 7 slumberers from the legend who, after 5 centuries, neither understood nor communicated with the others. Perhaps I have slept, Ferrari replied at some point, the magical sleep of knowledge, but Magenta and San Martino's canon woke me up, and then I realized or learned afterward that a great new thing was about to happen, Italian unity under the monarchy of Savoy. Proceed. But are you truly certain that Italy has completely emerged from the deep and murky night of its history, transformed as it was before? Otherwise it is you who have been sleeping, who are sleeping now more than ever, and your awakening will be far worse than mine. It may happen to Euthyddes not to awaken as I do in an hour of victory, a divine hour for all, but perhaps in the infame hour of disaster and repentance, or in that even more demoralizing one of vanishing illusions, overwhelming despair and crumbling hopes. We are precisely at this hour, sir. And if the conservative forces of liberal monarchy, which achieved national unity, remain inert and discordant, while all the dissipating and openly or covertly hostile forces are left to act alone and with full impunity, it could be far worse than Giuseppe Ferrari's forecast. The problem of Italy's historical trajectory would return to its starting point, from which the unitary program, this newness, this glory of our revolution, seem to have freed it forever. Heroes of the Revolution Conference of Francesco's. Nitty Italy is the land of heroes. Many times during my adolescent years, I copied this aphorism into my calligraphy notebooks. Even amidst the concerns of roundness and Gothic architecture, profiles and chiaroscuro, my inexperienced mind would ask, why indeed is Italy the land of heroes? The history we were taught in middle school, when it's not a dry succession of names and dates, is a series of marriages, conspiracies, and deaths. Occasionally, in this usually dreary history, an hero appears the man who embodies an entire era, the one who does what all other men should do. In small treatises, from the history of Greece and Rome to the French Revolution and Italy's liberation movements, the step is short and our minds become utterly confused. The people lie under the tyranny of a single ruler, to whom no one dares to rebel. The liberator hero steps in at the right time. A stab wound or a successful conspiracy accomplishes what the crowd cannot do. Sometimes an entire country lies subjugated by a foreigner and is freed through the heroic work of a single man. Since marriages, dates, genealogies of rulers don't interest us. We only remember the names and actions of heroes. They embody for us an entire period. And so my inexperienced mind combines the heroes of Salamis and Marathon, the Horadi, or untrustworthy, the Fabia, Caesar, Brutus, the heroes of the French Revolution, Garibaldi, and ours. Carlyle's concept is nothing more than the conception of our schoolchildren, humanity progressing, emancipating itself through heroes. According to him, Carlyle has written, I understand the universal history, the history of what man has accomplished on earth, in essence, as the history of great men who have labored here. Those greats were informers, models, and here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto, a long sense. What the general mass of men achieved or reached is precisely the external material result, the practical manifestation and embodiment of thoughts that once dwelt in the great ones sent down here. Their history could justifiably be considered as the soul of the history of the whole world. It is not less true that those men who to us seem to have guided the world were themselves the expression of societal and people's needs. The very men we perceive as most removed from and above their time are almost always its product. We cannot imagine Garibaldi in today's circumstances. Would he engage in obstructionism? Would he be against it? What ideas would he hold regarding the customs regime? What would he occupy himself with? If Napoleon had been born in India or China, what would have happened? Nothing, perhaps. That life, which it was one of history's greatest events, would have remained a small biological fact, the birth and death of individual among billions who have passed through the world since then. The most outstanding, the strongest, and the greatest men are therefore not something outside of other beings. They are those who can represent the collective soul or the need of a bolder and stronger minority. Heroic history, as we teach, and as we have learned, resembles, in a way, a geography that only describes mountains. Most of the Earth's surface is covered by vast plains and undulating hills. Immense mountains constitute a minor part, and even less significant for human life. The snowy Alps remain, in our eyes, more than the infinite plain, yet it is this latter that makes up the greatest portion of the surface we live on. Thus the details of history escape us. Humanity in its long journey has retained only the memory of a few precipices, forgetting the monotonous continuity of the happy plains it has crossed. We are an unremembering and ungrateful crowd, more sensitive to dreams than to successes, both in the past and present. Success, so that the crowd may notice and remember it, must be accompanied by a catastrophe. But true history, the one worth delving into, is collective history, the history of great human masses, of grand aggregations, of which we only investigate some expressions, and not always the happiest ones. It is a kind of mental laziness that leads us to explain history through the deeds of certain men. Even if they were immense, they could only be so due to particular contingencies and because they interpreted collective needs or nascent feelings. The silent hero, as Carlyle says, the hero who lives for himself and draws everything from his soul, has never existed nor will ever exist. Acknowledging this weakens us, as it leads us to a kind of Buddhist fatalism. Many times in difficult moments we say, "There is a lack of a man, done," and we wait. The providential man. Even now, amidst the difficulties of present-day Italy, which serve as a testament to its development, we still wonder if everything would not come to an end if we had a man. And well, the man is within us, he resides in each one of us, and when we seek him, we will find him. If there are no men who live outside and above their time, it is known that he who found the expression of Superman, Friedrich Nietzsche, ended up, that poor Übermensch, in a lunatic asylum with those theories that seem to have been born within. There are still men capable of performing extraordinary feats and achieving what the crowd cannot even conceive. In this sense, there are heroes. When a country is under domination and the crowd surrenders, there is a man who rebels alone or with a few others. If he has almost no hope of winning, if he does what the multitude believes to be foolish, then he is truly a hero. And so whether his blood serves as leaven for future revolutions or whether he himself triumphs, in either case, he is always a hero. But the hero, in this sense, is merely the expression of a malady, the collective baseness. The peoples who have the greatest number of heroes in modern civilization are those that suffer from the greatest depression. The hero is he who dares alone what countless others should do. When the crowd surrenders, there are those who offer themselves as sacrifices. He is thus the hero, the very highest expression of an ideal need for a depressed country. The greater the depression of the masses, the lower the collective consciousness, the weaker the sense of individual duty, the greater the number of heroes, and often their heroism. How many heroes in Greece during our revolution and in present-day Turkey? How many attempt in silence and pain? How many submit for everyone who wins or will win? But in a country where popular education is high, where collective consciousness has been formed, where everyone does their duty, there are no heroes. The Italians resigned themselves to servitude. Many heroes sacrificed themselves to awaken them from their slumber. There were those who went to die on a desperate mission, like Pisacane, and others like Garibaldi attempted a successful and daring endeavor, happy or unhappy with the outcome. Their souls were always immense. But in a country where mass education has been formed, where each individual feels a sense of responsibility, the hero is not possible. Nelson was a great sailor and Mulk a grand tactician. But was the victor of Trafalgar, who saw and foreseen, who had brave, devoted sailors under his command, truly a hero? And was Mulk an hero? The supreme German commander was a scientist. His severe, serious face of a mathematical chemist corresponded to a man who won battles in the depths of his study with algebra. A country where everyone does their duty, a country where solidarity is great, has no heroes. Here is the translation while preserving the name Ernesto Heroes. They can have great technicians, grand leaders, wise politicians, distinguished men for science. But they do not have heroes. The hero is like a mountain that does not rise from the earth's crust unless surrounded by deep valleys. Mountainous countries are filled with these valleys. There is the extreme height and there is the abyss. Countries that have produced the most heroes have only reached a degree of development and solidarity. Italy, during its period of depression, had an immense number of heroes, precisely because the social value of the crowd was low. Now we are more valuable, and perhaps some peaks are missing since the abyss is also lacking. The most heroic attempts always started from southern Italy, where indeed the collective consciousness was lower, and where nature itself allowed for some audacious plans and hope for their success. The legend of the 40 Normans who landed in Salerno and conquered the kingdom of Naples in a few days is not so unlikely if, after many centuries, attempts like those of Ruffo and Garibaldi were possible. Garibaldi, with just a few men, lands in Sicily and crosses almost without a scratch until Volturno, a kingdom that had 100,000 soldiers, seems almost legendary. A legend we would not believe unless we had known the actors involved. Well, the phenomenon of the Thousands Expedition must be studied in relation to the entire history of the past. Expeditions like those of the Thousand for freedom or for reaction, for unity or defense of the old regime have been attempted countless times. In 61 years, from 1799 to 1860, from Cardinal Ruffo to Garibaldi, there were many heroes who attempted audacious ventures in southern Italy with just a few brave men, a thing that reason rebels against. We only admire the victors, indeed. We only see the final success. If Pisacane had seceded a bit earlier and not lost his life at the foot of Sanza Hill, we would now glorify him as we do Garibaldi. If the two Bandiera brothers, in their almost mad attempt for sublime heroism, had not been held back in the sad land of Calabria shortly after landing, their names would have passed into history, surrounded by a very different aura than that of unhappy martyrdom. From the attempt made with complete success by a cardinal of Santa Chiesa, Fabrizio Ruffo, to restore King's entire kingdom from which he had fled, and to do so descending into combat with just a few men, until Garibaldi's attempt, there is a series of heroic endeavors. It would take too long to list them all, but let us remember the revolts of Morelli and Silviati, as well as the expeditions of the Bandiera brothers and Pisacane. In essence, Ruffo's path served as guidance for subsequent attempts. In 1799, King Ferdinand had been forced to flee to Sicily. The escape later became something of an institution for his family, leaving Naples with a small French army. The Neapolitan Republic and had been proclaimed, and the king, having lost the continental state, sought refuge in Sicily. Now, the attempt to resume with royal arms the rebellious provinces seemed almost desperate, unless a cardinal of the Curia, who seemed more experienced in the game than in military art, devised an exceedingly bold plan. A plan so daring that it seems nearly reckless, especially considering that the one attempting it was not a man at arms. Thus, Cardinal Fabrizio Ruffo decided to leave from Sicily, and without any army, to reconquer the kingdom for the king. He left with a few loyal followers, landed in Bagnara, which was his feudal domain. A handful of peasants formed the first nucleus of his army. His plan was simple. He knew that in southern Italy there was great hatred between the middle classes and the rural plebeians, and he wanted to move these last ones in favor of the monarchy and the king. He wanted to incite them against the bourgeoisie. The Jacobins belonged to the middle classes. The people would not have taken long to turn every landowner into a Jacobin. It was a social war in favor of legitimism and reaction. Cardinal Ruffo has been described as a rogue. He was better than his king in his reputation. He was an hero in all respects. What should one think of someone who, without being a soldier, and, as we said, without military experience, decides to reconquer an entire kingdom for a fleeing and cowardly king? We judge our own party's men differently from those of the opposing party. If Ruffo had accomplished the same feat to expel the Bourbons rather than restore them, if he had carried out the heroic and cruel enterprise in the service of freedom, we would see him almost as a divine man. Cardinal Ruffo did not have soldiers. He gathered whoever he could, peasants seeking revenge, poor people seeking plunder, even brigands. Could he do otherwise? Could he, with hardly anyone by his side, rely on others? Landing on the coast of Calabria in February 1799, the cardinal, who was accompanied by a few family members and some priests, reached the walls of Naples at the beginning of June. In 5 months, he reconquered for Ferdinand a kingdom. His journey was almost identical to that of Garibaldi 60 years later for an opposite cause, except that Cardinal Ruffo, to conquer even Irapulia, described in his travels a great arc of a circle for reaching Naples. He was welcomed, according to Coletta, with mad joy by the plebeians. And why was he welcomed? He also had the heroism that drags others along. Those who followed him were often country bandits and cruel thieves, but who, undertaking a nearly desperate enterprise, can choose his companions. Were they cruel? And weren't the French also cruel in San Severo and Gragnano? Wasn't General Vatron worse? If the expression class struggle is to be used once, it is in Cardinal Ruffo's adventure. He indeed used the hatred between rural plebeians and bourgeoisie to reconquer the throne for the king. He precisely calculated on that discord to succeed. There are few things more surprising than seeing a cleric with a few scattered followers do what here is the translation, while preserving the name an Ernesto an entire army had not known. What does it matter if he acted for a cause that is not ours? What does it matter if he made possible the cruelest reaction? He was a hero because he performed an act of extraordinary audacity, an adventure almost unbelievable for the cause he believed in. From Ruffo's adventure, which was the triumph of reaction, to the success of Garibaldi's 1000 expedition, which was the greatest triumph for unity, 61 years have passed. In this short time, how many times did Ruffo's expedition exalt the minds of liberals? Why couldn't what a priest had not done for the Bourbon cause be repeated against them? Why wasn't enough? It to spread the ranks of a conspiracy for a few daring men to overthrow the Bourbon throne. Exiled minds in their burning vigils dreamt countless times of following Ruffo's plan for an opposite cause. Sometimes, like in 1820, not even a landing was necessary. A few officers attempted a revolt and caused, though briefly, changes in the constitutional orders. But Ruffo's expedition remained the goal and the dream, to repeat it for the liberal cause, to audaciously recreate for freedom the triumphal journey of the reactionary prelate. Southern Italy has been and will always be the most suitable area for sudden revolutions. In our century, while wars with foreigners were fought in the Po Valley, all revolutionary attempts, or almost all of them, began in southern Italy. This land, with more coastline than any other part of Italy, stretching over a great length and not allowing easy concentrations, makes possible sudden blitzes. Calabria, thrown into the sea, is crossed at its full length by a chain of mountains. Inhabitants of countries just 15, 20 kilometers apart on opposite slopes often have no trade with each other. They don't even know each other. Now there are major railway lines running along the length. There are numerous roads. But when communications were difficult, as before 1860, a landing of just a few audacious men in Sicily or Calabria or on the Salento coast could have had immense consequences. Garibaldi was the triumph, but before him, countless young lives were cut short. Many brave men died victims of the deceptive mirage. They were true heroes because they took on an immense task while everyone else remained indifferent. Some failed due to excessive audacity, others through youthful inconsideration, and others because they didn't measure their strength or understand all the difficulties. Of all the expeditions that preceded Garibaldi's heroic endeavor, two stood out, those of the Bandiera brothers and Carlo Pisacane. The first for the heroic naivety which the two young men sacrificed themselves in the hope, not so much of victory, but of martyrdom that would awaken spirits. The second for the man who conceived it. Attilio and Emilio Bandiera were sons of a Contradmiral of the Austrian Navy, part of whom they also were, one as a ships in sign and the other as a frigates in sign. Not wanting to serve Austria, after taking part in some revolutionary movements, they had been hospitalized in Corfu. And in that contact with other exiles abroad, in that continuous exchange of aspirations and hopes, it was their idleness rather than exile that caused them the most regret. So they decided on a daring expedition, almost foolhardy. Along with Ricciotti, Moro, and a few bold individuals, they planned to land on the coasts of Calabria. They intended to incite the Calabrian populations to revolt, and if successful, set fire to the entire kingdom of Naples. In 1844, in the night between 12th and 13th, the two Bandiera brothers set sail for the Calabrian beach. They had a premonition of death. Just before departing, Nicola Ricciotti and Emilio Bandiera wrote to Garibaldi, "If we perish, tell our fellow citizens to follow our example, as life was given to us to be used rightly, and the cause for which we will have fought and died is the purest, most holy that has ever warmed men's chests. It is that of freedom, equality, humanity, independence, and Italian unity." They were good and sincere, above all possessing the youthful naivety without which it is impossible to carry out, or even attempt such an endeavor as they were embarking on. On June 16th in the evening, the small group landed on the Calabrian coast at the mouth of the Nebo River. The landing site was somber, but the Italian land seemed sacred to them, and they kissed it upon arrival. The poorly guided, inexperienced group also had a traitor among its ranks. The exiles hoped to find populations eager for revolt upon their arrival, but instead encountered hostility and indifference. In the valley of San Giovanni in Fiora, town already sacred to religious legend, surrounded by royal soldiers, after a desperate battle in which several died, they were forced to surrender. A month later, on July 25th, the two Bandiera brothers were executed in that same land from which they had hoped a signal for revolt would emanate. But no death was more mourned than theirs. They were young, wealthy, of noble birth. They had renounced all the joys of life with superhuman serenity. They possessed every quality to evoke mourning, and their death was one of the most devastating events for Ferdinand I. But it was not a vain death. Alessandro Perio sang, "The Italian land drank the wave of your blood, and it will never again be so fertile." Their town would have become a place of pilgrimage if, several years later, a cruelly vicious general had not, with a despicable and sacrilegious idea, profaned the noble grave, and had not mixed the bones of the two martyrs with those of common criminals. It doesn't matter. There is something that cannot be killed, something that cannot be profaned by anyone, something that has nothing to fear, and it is the memory of heroic goodness, of unhappy greatness. The Bandiera attempt was one that could not succeed, as it rested on unsubstantiated things. Yet no attempt is surrounded by so much poetry as this, precisely because it was unattainable for the very fact that it was impossible. Translation: the innocence with which it was carried out. Yet, among all the initiatives taken before Garibaldi's expeditions, none was more intriguing than that of Pisacane, less for the revolutionary attempt than for the man leading it, less for what he did than for what he intended to do. Carlo Pisacane, a Neapolitan, had held an authoritative and significant position in the State Department of the Two Sicilies. He came from a noble family. But above all, he was a restless soul yearning for novelties. He had fought against Arabs in Africa at Porto San Pancrazio in Rome. He lived in exile in Genoa in 1857. Based on inaccurate reports and counting on patriotic movements among the southern populations, he conceived the audacious idea of landing on the Salernitan coast in Salento, raising the populations, joining them to other rebels in Basilicata, and reaching Naples at the head of a numerous and rebellious army. The idea of Raffo, who was later to preside over Garibaldi's expedition, was also in Pisacane's mind. He alone shortened the distances, hoping to reach the capital as a surprise. Carlo Pisacane was an anarchist. He did not use this term, which was not in common use at the time, although Proudhon had already introduced it. Yet, in his doctrine outlined in the book essay on revolution, he openly manifests himself as an anarchist. What is anarchism? It is the extreme consequence of liberalism and rests primarily on the two concepts: the belief that humans have a natural tendency to work, produce, and associate, and the other belief that humans are corrupted by laws. These, in a sense, represent a harm because they are violence against the natural order of things. Like all extreme doctrines, anarchism is based on optimism, but precisely for this reason, it exerts an attractive allure on simple minds and unyielding spirits. It draws the ingenuous and the violent. What later came to be known as historical materialism, the Marxist conception of history, is clearly evident in Pisacane's work, which connected political and social production phenomena. Portions of his work seem written today, so modern is its inspiration. All laws, all reforms, even those appearing popular, only favor the rich and educated class because social institutions, by their nature, always benefit them. You plebeians, when you believe you are drawing closer to your goal, will instead be further away. You work, the idle ones rejoice. You produce, the idle ones dissipate. You fight, and they enjoy freedom. Universal suffrage is a deception. How can your vote be free if your existence depends on your master's salary or the owner's concessions? Undoubtedly, you will vote compelled by necessity as they desire. How can your vote be just when poverty condemns you to perpetual ignorance and robs you of every skill to judge men and their ideas? If the revolution had been successful, Pisacane had a plan to abolish private property and transform it into common property, abolish the state and move towards a sort of communism of production. However, as this was not in line with reality, he did not see or hear all the. Here is the translation, while preserving the name Ernesto difficulties that nature presented to all his plans. Like every anarchist, he saw evil not in nature and the limiting difficulties inherent in the human soul, but in human will, and effort by a bold minority seemed to him sufficient for everything. Yet, as error has its charm and illusion has fingers of rose, some pages of Pisacane cannot be reread even now without emotion. When he set sail for Sapri, Ernesto was already 40 years old. He had fought a lot, seen a lot. In his irregular life, in every sense irregular, he had lost his youthful illusions, which marked the expedition of the Bandiera. He was in every way a mature man. His expedition, which took place in 1857, was therefore undertaken with full awareness of the difficulties, indeed with the near certainty of death. And before leaving from Gino on June 24, 1857, he wanted to dictate his political will, a few pages that cannot be read without deep emotion even now. After affirming his socialist faith and noting that only a social revolution could bring good to humanity, Pisacane expressed his antipathy for constitutional movements. For me, I would make absolutely no sacrifice to change a minister to obtain a constitution, not even to expel the Austrians from Lombardy and expand the Sardinian kingdom. For me, the rule of House Savoy and that of House Austria are precisely the same. I also believe that the constitutional regime of Piedmont is more harmful to Italy than Ferdinand I's tyranny. I firmly believe that if Piedmont had been governed in the same way as other Italian states, the revolution would have been achieved. This conviction of mine arises from the fact that ideas come from facts, not vice versa, and the people will not be free when educated, but they will be educated when free. The revolution was to emerge from individual efforts. Some say that the revolution must be carried out by the nation. This is undeniable. But the nation is made up of individuals, and let's suppose that everyone waited for this day without conspirating. The revolution would never happen. On the other hand, if everyone said, Yika, the revolution must be carried out by the nation, of which I am an infinitesimal particle, but I also have my infinitesimal part to play, and I do it, the revolution would immediately become gigantic. After stating that he was going to Sapri in the Scythia Principality and declaring the purpose of the enterprise, Pisacane said, I have only my affection and my life to sacrifice for this purpose, and I do not doubt to do so. I am convinced that if the venture succeeds, I will receive universal praise. If it fails, everyone will blame me. They will call me foolish, ambitious, restless. And many who never do anything and spend their lives consuming others will examine the matter minutely, expose my errors. They accused me of not having succeeded for lack of mind, heart, or energy. But let them know that I believe them not only incapable of doing what I have attempted, but translation, incapable of thinking about it after discussing other bold enterprises and ventures that had encountered distrust and aversion. Pisacane continued, do not want to compare my endeavor with theirs, but it has a common aspect with them, universal disapproval before succeeding and after the disaster, and admiration afterward, if the outcome is successful. If Napoleon, before leaving Elba to land at Frey just with 50 grenadiers, had sought others' advice, everyone would have disapproved such an idea. Napoleon had the prestige of his name. I carry on my flag all the affections, and hopes that the Italian Revolution has in its possession all Italian nations' pains, and miseries fight on my side. To summarize, if I fail, I deeply despise the ignoble masses that condemn me, and I value little their applause upon success. All my ambition, all my reward is found at the bottom of my conscience and in the hearts of those dear and generous friends who have cooperated and shared my palpitations and hopes. And if no good will ever come to Italy from our sacrifice, it will always be a glory to find people willing to offer themselves for their future. The sincerity of his feelings and the certainty of the sacrifice Pisacane was about to make shine through every word. Pisacane, in a way, was the anarchist who, due to a sentimental contradiction, embarked on a unified political movement. He was the anarchist who, however, did not debate means, and as he did not believe in political forms, he would attempt everything. Not all his companions were worthy, and he would gladly empty prisons to find anyone who could help him, even if they rejected society. Did he not share the same aversion for defenders of the political system and those of the economic system? The phases of the expedition are unnecessary to recount here, nor is it worth mentioning how it was planned and with what means. Pisacane, along with 22 companions, based on largely uncertain promises, and counting on strong nuclei that Rosolino Pilo was supposed to lead from Sicily, boarded a Rubattino steamship in Genoa on the evening of June 5, 1857, with only 22 companions. The meeting with Pilo did not happen, yet Pisacane, with scant resources, still attempted his fortune and, with the captain's consent, made a daring landing at Ponza, freed many political exiles, and gathered a total of 303 men. He hoped to find more men upon landing in Sapri at the time of the operation on June 29th by the Cagliari, but found almost nothing. The landing took place on that gentle coast of Sapri, where there is so much sky and so much sea, where oranges grow like forests, and it's as if spring never ends. After declaring the government of Ferdinand I deposed, Pisacane and his companions sought to move the populations. But they only found indifference. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What did they want? Cardinal Ruffo was a churchman, and he had the prestige of red vestment and golden cross, speaking the language of passion and violence and stirring local hatreds. Here is the translation of the text. While preserving the name Ernesto, he placed the people against the bourgeoisie. But what did those who landed in Sapri want? The small group proceeded despite the indifferent popular aversion. After Sapri, the landscape becomes mountainous. These are rocky mountains, small plains filled with brambles, dwarf trees. The expedition that so joyfully landed in the streets of Sapri, where it should have felt a presentiment of death as it crossed this melancholic landscape. The warning had been given in time, and soldiers and gendarmes were on the move. The small expedition had only grown by a few men when, on the hill known as Morge del Piesco, it encountered the royal forces. After a fierce battle, where victory was within grasp, the arrival of royal troops from hunters forced the expedition to retreat, leaving 56 dead, over 30 wounded, and nearly 200 prisoners. During the retreat, Pisacane planned to hide in the woods and incite a revolt in Salento. But not far away, as they approached the town of Sanza, so sombre with its black houses, the men of the expedition were attacked by a mob of farmers and largely killed, wounded, or captured. Pisacane himself was killed. He who had dreamed of triumph or a heroic death, fighting in full sunlight, lay slain by the farmers in a sad countryside. Was he a stranger to them? A foe? But Pisacane's expedition was the prelude to a much greater event, Garibaldi's expedition. Just 2 years later, Garibaldi's expedition set sail from the Rock of Quarto, bound for Sicily, and brought rebellion to the south, where the government was already crumbling due to the leader's incompetence. Others have spoken of the Marsala expedition. Its legendary fortune is well known to all. By a strange coincidence, Garibaldi, after landing in Sicily with little resistance, triumphantly crossed it. He landed on the continent and entered Naples as a victor. What did this heroic attempt make possible, and why was it able to succeed? It almost seems unbelievable that a kingdom with 100,000 soldiers fell so quickly into the hands of a few men with such meagre resources. Well, gentlemen, in the opposite sense, what was the Ruffo expedition 61 years earlier? An heroic legitimist attempt had then reclaimed a country from the king that had been in the hands of the French and liberals. And one can truly say that Ruffo's expedition was not the preparation for all subsequent events in the opposite direction. I spoke about southern Italy because it is the land where the most daring expeditions have occurred, victorious or defeated, within a brief span of years. But throughout Italy, how many forgotten acts of heroism, daring exploits, and bold attempts? For every hero we remember, there is an anonymous crowd of the forgotten. Countless men died, silence and pain. Countless others perished during that springtime of sentiment that was the drive for unity. Blessed be the strong, the good, the brave, those who fought and suffered. Even more blessed are those we do not remember, and no one will ever remember again. Italy has truly been the land of heroes. If the hero is he who accomplishes extraordinary things alone, or attempts to do so and dies for them, Italy has been the sacred land of heroes, even from this fact that demonstrates the inner virtue of our people. We must draw reason for deep sadness. Why was Italy the land of heroes? Because individual responsibility sentiment was weak there, because individual culture was low, because the spirit of solidarity and discipline, which other more educated or luckier countries had, was lacking. Often in our country, one person has sought to accomplish those great works that should have emerged from collective consciousness. That's why we feel a sense of partiality, pride, individual violence, and distrust in democracy within our orders. Since men are not measured and tradition reigns supreme, we remain the sacred land of revolts. If the actions of a few people can do it all, if one person can arrogantly claim to do what a whole population should, if there are no pressing needs, then partiality, that is already in the instinct, creeps into consciousness as well. In Italy, we still bear the ancient illusions. Yet, even in schools, we continue to say that Italy is the land of heroes. We continue to praise individual violence, and we recognize violent attempts at past revolutions not as finished episodes, but as something grand and worthy of imitation. And we have even come to praise regicide, admire it, describe its benefits as if killing for any reason were permissible. And then we are surprised that our new democracy is inherently partial instead of possessing the qualities of order, method, and discipline without which no democracy can endure. We have praised regicide and deplored individual violence. We fill young minds with memories of conspiracies, sects, and revolts, while demanding discipline and solidarity. We teach heroic history, meaning a history of individual revolutions, and each individual revolution surprises us. The people do not like distinctions, nor do they understand that if the end is good, suppressing an absolute monarch is right, and suppressing a constitutional one is wrong. The popular soul loves what is simple, clear, and evident. What is most amazing is not that Italian unity was achieved, but that it has been maintained. Now, we must speak to the people in a different language. Every act of creation is only accomplished through violence. Even the chick that emerges from an egg, as naturalists say, makes a little revolution. But once it's out, its slow development is not a continuous fact without biological violence. We must consider our formation as a necessity, not a method. We must say that Italy was the land of heroes, not because it mattered much, but it mattered little. The heroes, that is, the audacious ones, in the weakness or indifference of the great majority, did what everyone should have done, but their works cannot be preserved and enhanced and improved unless here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Ernesto with progressive education. Every act of creation is an act of violence, but it's a phase, and once crossed, development must be slow and continuous. We must stop waiting for a providential man in every situation. We need to convince ourselves that this providential man is within all of us, and we should consider other men not as a means, but as the end goal. The providential man does not exist, and if a man is given more than others, we shouldn't exaggerate what one person can do. Those great politicians or financiers that we often envy in others, if they were transported to our midst, would undo what our people do, for they are great because they steer movements that actually exist. This Buddhist contemplation, where in every party we refrain from active good deeds and wait for the strong man, the providential man, is the most dissolving idea one could imagine. And it's a result of our heroic conception of history. Human societies are valuable to the extent they value not some men, but all the men who compose them. The durable prevailing peoples are those with higher intellectual and material education for their masses and greater solidarity. Where collective spirit vibrates more strongly, where unity is greater, their strength is also greater. Consider instead what effect our teachings have on ignorant minds filled with hatred and superstition. We are the heirs to the merits and faults of our fathers, and we already write the history of our children through our own deeds. Let's make this history less biased, teach that human labor is sacred, that violence, whatever its form, is evil, instill that respect for human freedom from which we unfortunately stray. Also avoid repeating what is not true, that the past is greater than the present. For 3 centuries now, Italy has not been what it is today in 40 years of unity, of this unity that with its injustices is always our greatest good. In 40 years of unity, we have made immense progress. We were nothing, and we are much richer, much more cultured, much better than our fathers. We are also more discontent, and that's good too, because supine resignation is for the weak. Now let's shed our old prejudices and tell it all. Italy has been the land of heroes because it meant little. When everyone feels their duty and sense of responsibility, when we have above all fought against the soft germs of poverty and the fermentations of ignorance, then we will no longer need heroes. We may have great statesmen, great technicians if needed, great strategists, but never again heroes in the sense we have had them until now. Sirs, you remember the episode that historians have often recounted, popularized by a powerful novelist, in the night preceding the most decisive battle of the Franco-Prussian War. Neither the German nor the French army was at their designated positions. Here is the translation of the text with the name preserved as Ernesto over great distances and within the French field where initial defeats had cast a deep sorrow. Every move of the enemy was followed with indescribable anxiety. Now, during the tragic vigil, a mighty voice echoed from afar. In the cold and solemn night, all German soldiers prayed and sang Luther's choral, Together a Unified, solemn song, almost a declaration of shared hope and an inevitable victory. Those same French soldiers who had shown bravery even in defeat felt a cloud of sorrow descend upon them, more so than the cannon's roar. It was that song that shocked them, for they realized they were not fighting an army, but an entire people with a single soul. Will we also find this great word of unity? Can we abandon our errors and prejudices? From Brescia's 10 days to the Battle of San Martino, the conference of Pompeo Momenti. No, gentlemen, this time the poets do not exaggerate. Brescia, with a wonderful example of warrior virtue, demonstrated, as Vincenzo Monti had truthfully called it, rich in honor, iron, and courage. And after a high and supreme test of Brescian valor, poetry still responded accurately to history's stern judgment when Alberdi sang Brescia from its fertile mountains of swords, Niobe warrior from my lands, lioness of Italy, and Carducci. Then, turning to the Statue of Victory, among the ruins of Vespasian's temple, exclaimed, Happy fate that gathered me in Brescia, the strong Brescia, the iron Brescia, the Brescia lioness of Italy, sated with enemy blood. Indeed, there is such grandeur in Brescia's struggle against the stranger of brief, but fierce and desperate fight, sustained with untamable courage, that one could say this is the most heroic chapter of that ill-fated yet not few revolution, which began evolution as political resurrection half a century ago. We recall those times and tests because during days of intense suffering, the homeland appears holier than in times of triumph. In that impetuous bayonet charge against the stranger, the 1848 revolution, Brescia found itself immediately on the front line. After driving out Austrian garrison Schwarzenberg, raised the national flag atop Sydney Hill. Italian blossoming in illusions and hopes quickly withered, and foreign tyranny once again cast a dark shadow over national freedom. Following Custoza's defeat came the Salasco armistice, and on August 16, foreign soldiers entered Brescia. Between unjust persecutions and frequent hopes, 1849 opened. Firing squads, whips, prisons, insults all met with a murky, somber stir not only in Brescia, but in nearby countryside and valleys where secret meetings of patriots were held. Hearts still yearned for hope, gazing at the tricolor flag still flying over glorious cities, Rome and Venice and Piedmont, which once again embarked on defending trampled rights. With the Salasco armistice denounced, Charles Albert left Turin and headed towards Lombardy. In Brescia, where he led the Lombard conspiracy, an energetic committee of citizens prepared for insurrection. On March 19th, atop hills that overlooked the city, a cry rang out, "Long live Italy." Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto. The beautiful city was crowned, it appeared, with a squadron of armed men and herald of freedom, priest, boy, father, soul of an apostle and soldier, burning with divine enthusiasm to fight for his country. The vengeance flame ignited on March 23rd. A new arrogance from foreign troops sparked the people's uprising, who drove away the Austrian garrison just in time for them to retreat into the dominating castle within the city walls. And from the castle at midnight a furious bombardment began. The cannon's roar echoed far across the fields, repeated echoes from the surrounding mountains, an august signal to the people's militias, prepared for desperate defenses. All weapons were used, and the cobblestones, disrupted by men, women, and children, served to build barricades with invincible stubbornness. The fighters pushed themselves into danger, refusing to compromise with the stranger. Meanwhile, from Mantua, Austrian battalions led by General Nugent rushed towards Brescia, but upon reaching the city gates they found enthusiastic squads guided by Boy, Fava, and Spiri, ready to demonstrate that Brescia that neither was neither an easy nor a helpless prey, and it lacked neither brave hearts nor arms, and stubborn virtue to resist. With heroic daring, our men pushed back the Croats and wanted to chase them, had not Tito Spiri, an improvised leader of a motley crowd, but with the eye of an experienced captain, restrained their imprudent fervour. For over 100 valiant ones held firm against Nugent's battalions for 3 hours, who, turning to the parliamentarians, said, "We will enter Brescia by love or force." To which Spiri replied, by force perhaps, never by love, and he returned among his fellow soldiers, a soldier of his country. With what ancient dignity this noble figure of a patriot and warrior crossed the death fields. In the marvellous Brescian decade, Tito Spiri gloriously among a crowd of valiant men. Everything about him was sincere indignation and forgiveness, anger and love, sentiment and thought. To Nugent's haughty words, the people responded with a shout, war and death. And to this terrifying cry soon followed the rumble of German cannons and the ringing of Brescia's bells. The Austrian assaults were always repelled, but the cruel losses suffered by the Brescians were not compensated by those, though greater, of the enemy, who had General Nugent himself mortally wounded. Only on the 29th did they learn that Italian fortune had been shattered at Novara. This immense misfortune seemed to revive their courage. The bullets crashing into the barricades made a deafening noise, and the Brescians, without shelters, showed themselves equally terrifying to their enemies, vowing to their dead the honour of bloody funerals. Hainaut, the terrible Hainaut, who was encamped outside Venice under siege, seethed with indignation upon learning that after 7 days of struggle, the well-trained imperial militias were still unable to overcome a disorganized crowd of poorly armed peasants. The fierce soldier took immediate measures. Abandoning the siege of Venice, he rushed towards. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto Brescia, and with the aid of the night, he penetrated into the castle, together with many militias. When, at dawn the following day, the Austrian marshal from the castle's rampart looked before him, Brescia appeared superbly beautiful, even though the day was grey. From the streets within the walls, a murmur of joyful and bold cries rose, almost like the city's voice, pulsating with miraculous life and ignited by indomitable virtue. The Brescians, with strong hearts, healthy genera, stood vigilant in the custody of their homeland. Through a hazy veil you could barely make out the populous neighborhoods, the fertile and fortified hills, the scattered villas. Under the dark plants that crowned the mountains, the green valleys were just distinguishable, and the Lombard plains stretched mysterious and undefined, fading into the horizon's grey vapours. And there below Brescia, towering around with palaces and churches, illuminated even under the grey sky by the sun of freedom. What thoughts would have stirred in that hour in the depraved mind of the stranger? Yeah. It is only in the thought of the good that the beauty and youth of nature become beautiful and sweet alike. Nothing but our ferocious desires for slaughter or domination animated that deadly one, who immediately sent a message to the municipality demanding without delay the surrender of the city, threatening looting and devastation. The threats doubled his audacity. With danger, his noble purpose grew stronger and more fierce. Flaring with anger, everyone rushed to brandish their weapons. No, Italy had never seen such determined courage. How many companions did the Greek woman have in Brescia who answered, "I gave birth to this," to those announcing her son dead in battle? How many Brescian women from the barricades watched their relatives fight and felt pride? All the bells began to ring in unison, and when the cannon signalled, the troops rushed out of the castle, and the city was attacked from all 5 gates. The tempest of iron and fire raged furiously. Death mowed down Brescia's bravest. From the smoking ruins rose a voice to the people: "All is lost. All is surrender. It will save you." The people, with stubborn heroism, refused every proposal for surrender. Haynau, thinking to make another step forward, sent several battalions towards a square in the city called the Square of the Albera, the Brescian Thermopylae. Here, resistance was more than human. 30,000 of these possessed Brescians conquer Paris, exclaimed Haynau, watching from the castle the epic struggle. The Austrian ranks fell at the feet of the fortifications. Not a shot went astray. Those magnificent Brescians, driving out deafening cries of victory, furious, blinded, delirious, appeared on high, black with dust and twisted, above the defences. Yeah. Gripping daggers and knives with powerful hands, gnashing their teeth with bulging veins, with wide, open eyes injected with blood, in which the pupils gleamed maliciously, they ran at full speed towards the enemies, wanting, as they said, to smell their breath. And such was the impulse, so terrifying the appearance of these terrible fighters, that many enemies scattered, discouraged, confused, sought refuge in flight, while others were conquered by an invincible terror, a mysterious fear. From sheer terror, frozen, silent, their breath suspended, they were killed or wounded before snapping out of the shock. What a shame for the imperial weapons. But that day on the square of the Eldo, German sword glinted. This is true glory. The fierce marshal, despairing of bending with arms the invincible resolve of the Brescians, ordered that houses be set ablaze with quicklime and pitch, so that soon the darkness was gloomily illuminated by fires. Then the leaders of the city and the defense committee gathered for council. The destruction of homes, the crackling of fires, the thunder of muskets, the roar of cannons, all spoke in a grim voice that it would be madness to prolong the defences, that German rage would turn even fiercer against the city, and that surrendering would save from further loss of life a tragic waste of blood. And the divinely torn, bloody, shattered people responded that they wanted to fight on. Brescia welcomed fate with dignity upon its head. the dying freedom of Italy to the heroic violence with which April 1st renewed the battle. It seemed that Brescia was not exhausted from 9 days of titanic struggle. In the fury of the Brescians, whose hearts roared with the spirit of battle, even the old militias of despotism flared up once more. But new artillery and battalions arriving from Ticino and Mincio, oppressed with a torrent of fire, crushed with the power of arms, did not defeat the defenders of Brescia. Parts of the city then presented a spectacle to freeze one's veins. Soldiers looted, set fires, killed women, old people, children. Rivers of blood ran, walls were stained red, courtyards flooded with blood. Piles of bodies lay in the streets, skinned, torn, crushed masses of lacerated flesh. Sometimes it is a serene writer who tells it, Currenti. These savages tried to force the living to swallow ripped viscera of their loved ones. Other times they hurled heads of tender children among the Brescian ranks. The barricades fell with a mighty roar. The lugubrious procession of comrades, carrier-aides carried on stretchers, passed by with split foreheads and torn chests. The ranks were swept away by machine-gun fire, and the people, with their weapons at their throats, fiercely resisted when ordered to surrender or submit. Already the white flag fluttered over the loggia between the flames of the fires. They still fought with courage stronger than the enemy's barbarity. To a friar who had ventured into the hail of bullets to visit Hainault Castle, the implacable imperious Austrian general, with grim irony, replied that the peaceful citizens would suffer nothing hostile. But what peaceful citizen would still be found among the survivors? Among the survivors, many indomitable heroes had bathed the soil of their homeland in their blood, which seemed to throb with revulsion. History remembers the events more than the names. What do names matter? They were all ready to die, as they said, in the Brescian way. Here is one who, torn open by balls, and says, "Lucky me, I have the honor of dying first on the battlefield." "And I, too," responded another whose intestines were torn apart by the machine gun. A third, gravely wounded, refused help from his comrades so they wouldn't abandon their post. There are many memories, sacred memories, gentlemen, that unite our country in its glorious moments alongside the unfortunate but heroic acts of valor displayed by the old Piedmontese aristocracy just days before on the fateful fields of Novara. The dark-haired Brescian, who, with a hat perforated by 3 bullets, charged 4 Austrians, killing one and driving off the others, then returned to his companions, saying, "I got good value for my hat," and the other unknown plebeian, whose left arm was severed by a bomb, and after emptying his rifle with his right hand, he fell to the ground shouting, "Long live! I still have an arm for my sword. Aren't they equal in virtue and glory to that old patrician Perone from San Martino, who at Bacocca, fatally wounded, collapsed from his horse, saying to King Charles Albert, 'My duty is now complete,' and to Count Robeland, who, holding his bloody stump high, shouted, 'Long live the king!' There's a common lineage in all these heroes whose family motto is country and valor. Hainault, who left his mark on history with blood on his forehead, imposed harsh terms on Brescia, which the city's leaders had to accept. But not everyone in Brescia born with the instinct for desperate existence in their blood. The walls could be breached, but not the breasts. They wanted to resist to the bitter end. An excuse for opponents to cruelty everywhere and to violate the surrender agreements unjustly. Irrefutable evidence speaks of horrors committed by the soldiery, fires, executions, violence, stories of unarmed citizens beaten, tortured, some burned alive, others hung or roasted, some murdered in bed. Hiding places, it claims them neither age nor gender elicited mercy, as women and old men were found torn with wounds, children crushed against walls or trampled on the ground, impaled by bayonets and left there amidst horrific contortions under the eyes of their mothers. Those human beasts entered a boys' school and slaughtered 5. Others, drunk from inhaling blood fumes, stormed a house and, in front of a mother's eyes, murdered a young epileptic. A priest who left town to seek news of his mother was executed. Another priest was covered in pitch and burned alive after seeing 2 young granddaughters raped, and a nephew slaughtered. An old man, not willing to swear on the imperial flag, was stabbed by bayonets. A commoner named Carlo Zima avenged himself, dying burnt along with one of his torturers. Oh, abhorrence! The soul can no longer bear these nefarious atrocities, whose mere memory obscures our reason and makes our hearts tremble with blood-stirring palpitations. Thus, by the hand of a carnage soldier, Brescian freedom was strangled, and between military tyranny and the thievery violence of the barbarians, sceptical and vile Europe watched indifferent. But those martyrs kept Italy alive, and from those massacres emerged a voice of resurrection. Brescia, which during those memorable days shone Italy with its heroic virtue, had gathered from its own history and the blood of its martyrs, had confided the right that within the sacred circle of the Alps and the sea, the homeland should not be contaminated by foreign rule. Dark times of tyranny followed. Austria, with impudent military audacity, sought to ensure obedience through terror, suspicion, and arbitrary power. Lombardy and Venice, oppressed worse than any other country in unhappy Italy, plummeted from a height of illusions and hopes into horrible calamities. The martial bravado of Radetzky did not even obey Vienna's ministers, who wanted to put a break on the reign of the sword. But the spirits and intellects of Italians were not lost, nor had all hope been extinguished, and the nation learned from suffering the secret of resurrection, and, instructed by experience, prepared with determination to retrieve the test, to affirm freedom and the homeland through reflection, action, word, and blood. Italy's sky is still crossed by fires of patriotism, and secret societies, inspired by the National Committee established in London by Mazzini, plotted conspiracies ready to explode into open revolt. In Mantua, where the foreign soldiers' fury was most fierce, a committee of patriots was formed, with Enrico Tazzoli, a priest of holy life, as its soul. Austrian ferocity stifled rebellious hopes through torture, imprisonment, beatings, confiscations of property, fines, exiles, and violations of common law and treaties. Persecutions ignited anger, and the bloodshed sowed the seed of freedom. The new series of martyrs began with the heroic civilian Caesar from Milan, shot on August 2 of 1851. Following him in glorious death are Dotizio from Como, strangled in Venice, priest Graioli, shot in Mantua, then taken to suffering on Belfior's ramparts were Enrico, Tazzoli, Scarsellini, Zambelli, Canal, Poma, Grazioli, and Montanari. Many who escaped the gallows were first buried in the grim mud of Mainolda, then sent to serve their sentence for loving their homeland in Bohemian prisons. When the soul retreats to the sanctuary of the past, where worldly tempests roar like the tempestuous surge of the ocean against a safe shore, among the evening vapours we see, noble and holy among all others, the figure of Tito Spiri, the hero of Brescia's 10 days, hanging from Belfior's gallows. That pallid ghost is not accompanied by any feeling of rancour or vengeance. The night before his punishment, the heroic young man who was to abandon life at 28 wrote a letter to Alberto Cava, a letter that cannot be read without deep emotion. In my life, he writes, I have sometimes tasted joys, but I assure you, in comparison to those I feel now, they were nothing but miserable mud. My joy at thinking that soon I will die for my country is so vivid and intense that if Italians could grasp the idea, they would all be killed. With the same burning enthusiasm, the martyrs of the early church went to their deaths for religion today. After such a brief span of time, those generous ones who gave us a homeland seem so distant from us. Those noble acts of courage appear so far removed from these days, where every sense of patriotism has been destroyed by public affairs turned into vanity, by practical business that turns the soul into money. But then the homeland was truly a religion which taught the nobility of dying for a high ideal and learned the powerful effect of virtue, which came from the heart in those modern saints, religious virtue. Practiced out of love for the invincible sentiment of eternal beauty, eternal justice, and eternal truth. The virtue of affection, which vibrated with hope, but did not flee pain and felt measured, and endured it. The virtue of sacrifice, which calmly refused life for beloved homeland. Then, no persecution, however fierce, could subdue the mind's yearning for freedom. Piedmont, the noble sanctuary of Italy, welcomed refugees from oppressed province and treated them as citizens. Letters in Lombardy and Venice, while retaining revolutionary forms that had prepared for 1848, but always imbued with hatred towards foreigners, continued to arm minds for the conquest of liberty. Camillo di Cava, in whom the spirit of a citizen was even greater than the sharp mind of a minister, embraced Mazzini's concept of Italian unity with sure penetration and embodied it in the monarchy of Savoy, accomplishing one of history's most beautiful revolutions. Europe had already formed the conviction that Austria would soon lose command in Italy, and that Italy, after so much sacrifice, struggle, work, study, had every right to become an independent nation. Austria, ashamed of its unjust oppression and reproached by all civil nations for its forms of government, then thought to use, after the gallows and prisons, a more insidious weapon, flattery. No, exclaimed Daniel Manon, the magnanimous exile, we do not ask Austria to remain to be liberal in Italy, but we don't demand it leave. We don't know what to do with its humanity and liberalism. We only want to be masters in our own home. The proof that Austria had not changed and hid its ancient ferocity came from the new gallows erected in 1855 in Mantua, where Pietro Fortunato Calvi, the hero of Cadore, was hanged. One day, the Italian flag appeared on the bastions of Sevastopol alongside the banners of the strongest peoples of the West. After the war with Russia at the Paris Congress, Italy's cause was solemnly declared of European interest and referred to the Supreme Court of Christian civilization. Count di Cava boldly proclaimed that Austria in Italy has always been expected. Italy no longer felt alone, abandoned. It eagerly awaited events. And what unbridled joy from one end of the peninsula to the other shook the peoples not long after, upon learning that France, the glorious Latin sister, was extending her hand to Italy to rise and shake off its chains. Here is the translation of the text preserving the name Ernesto Freedom and the onset of serfdom. In the early days of May 1859, Victor Emanuele and Napoleon I led their armies, while Garibaldi commanded his Alps hunters. On May 20th, the Austrians suffered their first defeat in Lombardy from Franco-Piedmontese weapons at Montebello. On the 30th, they were routed at Palestro. Between these two victories, on May 23rd, Garibaldi triumphantly entered Varese, and on the 27th he arrived in Como. On June 4th, the Allied armies crossed the Ticino River, and the French defeated their enemy at Magenta, then at Melegnano on the same day. At this point, Victor Emanuele and Napoleon entered Milan, greeted by frenzied enthusiasm from the liberated populations. The Allies advanced rapidly towards the Mincio, where the Austrian army, having withdrawn to the left bank, was concentrated and reinforced with fresh and numerous militias under the supreme command of Emperor Franz Joseph himself. On June 16th, Victor Emanuele entered Brescia, followed 2 days later by Napoleon. The enemy was closer across the Mincio. A formidable quadrilateral protected one of the world's most aggressive and disciplined armies. The struggle was difficult. Despite their previous defeats, the Austrians, always superior in numbers, seemed to have favorable chances for victory. On June 24th, people packed the streets of Brescia. Anxious inquiries filled the air among citizens, and a mix of hope and trepidation permeated the atmosphere. Distantly, relentlessly, the cannon's roar echoed through the valley. Just a few miles from Brescia, fate would be decided for Italy. On June 23rd, Emperor Franz Joseph, resuming the offensive, had his army cross the Mincio. Neither the Franco-Piedmontese nor the Austrians expected to meet so soon, and no one anticipated an immediate battle. The two armies were moving towards each other, unaware of their proximity, on terrain between the Chiese and Mincio rivers, with Lake Garda as a boundary on one side and ending in the vast Mantuan plain on the other. There were 163,000 Austrians with 688 cannon spread out over approximately 30 kilometers, with their right wing near Lake Garda, the center in the group of hills dominated by Solferino and Cavriana, and the left towards the Mantuan plain. There were 155,000 allies, 552 artillery pieces, with Piedmontese on the left occupying strong mountain positions leading down to the plain from Lake Garda, while French army bodies under Barangay de Hilliers, Mac, Mahan, Niel, and Canrabat spread out over the Mantuan plain from Lonato and Castiglione, sites of memories from other Napoleonic wars. It was Niel who first collided with a powerful surge against the Austrians, who stood firm in equal determination. Soon, hand-to-hand combat ignited everywhere, more fierce in the center at Solferino, where Napoleon I, with a conceptiveness worthy of his great uncle, commanded maximum effort. That was indeed the place for victory. The struggle was long, obstinate, atrocious, and for many hours, despite French impetuousness and audacity, it seemed as if the Austrians would prevail due to their superior numbers and steadfastness. After a stubborn resistance, the Austrian army retired, broken and bloodied. The arms of France were winning everywhere. Things were very different on the left wing, where the Piedmontese had found themselves facing one of the most formidable Austrian bodies, under the command of a most valiant general, Benedek. The battle began at 7 in the morning, and our troops were advancing towards Pozzolengo. They had been able to conquer the important positions of San Martino and Madonna della Scoperta, but after being assailed by a numerous enemy, they were driven away after a short but fierce struggle. Our attack renewed itself, but disjointed, without order, sending soldiers piecemeal, who with admirable valor several times seized the heights, and several times were repulsed. The Austrians occupied San Martino and Madonna della Scoperta strongly. General Durando vainly attacked this second hill, while General Mollard, a more valiant soldier than able commander, attacked San Martino and won. But a vigorous counterattack did not take long to repel him back to the foot of the height. It was not, however, the confusion of flight. Mollard reorganized his men and held his ground against enemy positions, waiting for new and fresh troops, showing himself ready to try again, while Benedek gathered his army on the hill of San Martino, daring not to descend to aid Solferino, where fortune leaned in favor of France. When Baraguaguay de Hilliers and Mahan succeeded in occupying Solferino, the Austrians had to abandon Madonna della Scoperta, soon occupied by General Durando. Victor Emanuele, running here and there, where the danger was most terrible, felt with anxiety that Benedek, repelling with good success several vigorous attacks of ours, maintained himself firm on the peaks of San Martino and the nearby hills. The veiler of Italian arms did not want to smile upon fortune. More than fate pressed the magnanimous king was the honour of Italy. He then ordered La Marmora to take charge of 2 divisions, join them with those of Mollard, and was about to attempt a general furious assault when a terrifying storm broke out. The battle remained unfinished, as it was impossible for the soldiers, because of the fury of the wind accompanied by violent hail, to advance or stand up. When from the broken clouds the sun reappeared, the men returned to the attack. The Piedmontese rose resolute and ready. In vain were the enemy's artillery fulminating those brave ranks that advanced tightly, terrifying in appearance. A cry burst out Savoia from thousands of breasts, drums rolled, music sounded, and Italian soldiers descended terribly to the assault. But no less terrible were the defences. It is a most bitter and mortal fight. You fight with bayonets, swords, daggers, rifle butts, stones, fists, nails, teeth. Finally, fortune turns in favour of Italy. The Austrians begin to waver. Our troops gain strength. The counter-attack, the house where Benedek had been most stubbornly resisting, is taken. The Austrians are driven down the slope, and a great cry rises, "Long live Italy! Long live the king!" The day was ending, and French-Italian artillery saluted victory on those fields where 160-22 Frenchmen and 691 Italians lay dead. Here is the translation of the text. While preserving the name Ernesto, 2,386 Austrians, 8,530 wounded, and 1,518 prisoners and missing. Among the French, 3,572 and 1,258 missing. Among the Austrians, 10,634 and 9,290 missing and dispersed. The sole and holy purpose of so much bloodshed was nearly achieved. One more battle under Verona, and the task was complete. Justice was done. Suddenly, amidst those hopes, the peace of Villafranca broke out like a lightning bolt. We will not delve into how the sudden decision may have been influenced by news from Germany, which saw French victories as a danger and a threat. The peace on the Mincio perhaps avoided war on the Rhine. It seemed for a moment that Italy must forever yield to her adverse fate. Upon the radiant glories of Palestro and Varese, Montebello and San Martino, Magenta and Solferino hung a funeral veil. Anguish and tears erupted uncontrollably in Veneto, once again condemned to abhorrent servitude, while the happiest brothers from Lombardy, Tuscany, and Emilia rose with renewed freedom's first golden rays. When Napoleon read Vittorio Emanuele the chapters of the Peace of Villafranca, he could not restrain himself from exclaiming, "Wretched Italy!" And, having the emperor added, "Now we shall see what Italians can do on their own." "I hope," replied Vittorio Emanuele, "that we all will do our duty." And they did. Count Cava, who in a memorable conversation with Vittorio Emanuele wanted the king to reject the peace in disgust, resigned as minister and wrote to Farini, who announced from Modena his determination to resist, even at the cost of his life, upon the Duke's return. The minister is dead, the friend applauds your resolution. But after the anger subsided and sorrow calmed, it was the same Count Cava who wrote to Prince Jerome Bonaparte, "Blessed be the peace of Villafranca." Sacred foresight of genius! A new victory won with France's help would indeed have liberated Venice and established a strong kingdom in northern Italy, but it would have made French supremacy all-powerful on the peninsula, restoring princes unloved by the people back onto the throne. The changing political circumstances altered the course of Italian minds, and the concept of Italian unity was renewed through these events. Without Villafranca, it would not have been possible for the warrior king to display his magnificent audacity. Instead of being the conscience and arm of revolution, he would have had to respect the agreements imposed by France. Without Villafranca Garibaldi, the epic knight could not have, with Piedmont's help, along with England's cooperation, overthrown the nefarious Bourbon government, a denial of God. Without the peace of Villafranca, Cava would not have been able to allow his enthusiastic soul to speak as a citizen higher than the prudent and closed spirit of a diplomat. Finally, without the peace of Villafranca, the best men from the peninsula could not have jointly raised the august cry of freedom alongside your holy name, Italy. Rome was still a slave. Venice struggled between reinforced chains. Naples and Sicily trembled under an abhorrent yoke. But there remained their great idea, Italia, great sentiment, love for the fatherland, more tenacious, more powerful from the pain of shattered illusions. Yes, the love for one's country, gleaming purer in the light of sacrifice, still stood firm with all its might until its ultimate end in every way. Now, a more resolute will had awakened, the spirit of sacrifice and energy for good were ignited, that sacred union of the future, of hope, of struggles that Italy was to lead to triumph over the intact shield of Savoy. Italy and Victor Emanuele echoed across every part of the peninsula, uniting brothers, summoning opponents to battle, erasing regional traditions, municipal pride, and secular conflicts. The land of Italy blushed with Italian blood, preparing for the king's triumph. The plebiscites confirmed the people's desires, and on February 18th, 1860, the first Italian parliament convened. A month later, Victor Emanuele I was proclaimed king of Italy by law. Thus, gentlemen, in these great events of history, men who believe they can direct them are instead pulled along by them. And at the heart of the picture lies the dark, ignored hero who decides everything and everyone, the conscience of the people, which awakens and imposes itself at certain moments. The Italians were ready for their great national redemption. Even Napoleon, with the best and highest intentions, could divide Italy into new kingdoms, but now our people's consciousness was so awake and vigilant, the men who directed or expressed it, the king, Cava, Garibaldi, Ricasoli, Farini, Minghetti, and others of such great stature, were so worthy of interpreting it that any mistake or betrayal in politics would find a way to twist it for the sake of national unity. If Napoleon continued the war, unity would have been achieved at the time desired by history, with or without him, or even against him. Stopped at the Mincio River, the pain of disappointment further intensified the need for unity in a people like ours, represented by statesmen like ours, who at certain moments combined the qualities of heroes with those of the most refined diplomats. Cava, in his harsh conversation with the king after Villafranca, is a hero who forgets his ministerial duties towards his king. Garibaldi, who can stop and obey on the slopes of Teruel, is an instant politician who lets the hero be forgotten for a moment. And all these careless courage and all these holy devices were needed by our country to unite, even when it seemed that heaven and earth, the Pope and Napoleon I opposed its unification. And thinking about those days of our redemption, when neither the nation nor the men who directed it made mistakes, when it seemed that all the greats of our history rose from their tombs to inspire the living, we must also be more indulgent towards present miseries and less pessimistic. Each day there is not a country to be created, but neither are the languors, errors, and faults of contemporaries robbing us of our faith. In the days of supreme danger, one would not find the energies of 59 and 60. For it is against the law of historical continuity that a people which 40 years ago was composed entirely of seers, diplomats, and heroes should now be formed only of grumblers, critics, and mediocrities. Let the hours of great peril come, and we shall find ancient greatness. Let us raise our ideals, and we shall find the old fervours. The greatest responsibility of this dark hour is in the smallness of political leader, but outside of politics, in industries, arts, and sciences. Italy of 59 and the 60 still exists. The Gentle King 1859 conference by Domenico Oliva. King Carlo Alberto had wanted to try again on his soul as a king and patriot, the armistice of Salasco, the last and futile defense of Milan, the scenes of violence, ingratitude, and madness from which the streets of the Lombard metropolis had been despoiled, weighed heavily like memories of insults and blood. All Italy was still seething. Lombardy, subjugated yet unbroken, seemed ready for a rebellion. Venice remained free and defended itself against Austria, inflaming with the fierce spirit of Daniel Manin and kindling visions of war and extreme hopes. Tuscany, Romagna, Rome were torn apart by dark and base civil discord, but not yet defeated. The King of Naples had revealed himself, but the people of those lands still spoke of freedom and waited. Sicily, risen in arms, defied the enemy. The poetic age was over. No more idyls, no more joyful crusades, only fury. Instead, it seemed as if victory were promised to despair, and if not to win, then to die, leaving a bloody and torn Italy on the path of triumphant reaction, the last protest, the last vengeance, the final incitement to the renewed ire of distant descendants. This, in general, was the moral and material condition of the homeland. Let us turn our gaze to the specific conditions of the subalpine kingdom. I believe that never before had a king and a people faced such dire straits in a great trial as Carlo Alberto and Piedmont did during the grim and incipient spring of 1849. Reactionaries and revolutionaries spread all sorts of venom among the nation's masses and among those who were to fight. Some claimed that the king was betrayed, while others said he was a traitor. The price of treason was the honor, security, and freedom of the people. They preached distrust, preparing for sedition. No one believed. The chamber shouted. The ministers knew. Not the supreme head of the army was a stranger, even unknown to our language. The soldiers were numerous, but either too old or too young, untrained or exhausted, not aggressive, not organized, the aristocracy ready for sacrifice, yet nauseated by demagogy or dominant or about to dominate, the clergy afraid of novelties, the crowd swaying, uncertain, impoverished, pained by recent misfortunes, unprepared to face and sustain the new. Thus they attempted to defeat Marshal Radetzky, who had clarified himself the previous year as a fierce and powerful captain, to push him back into the fortresses he had vehemently defended, forcing him to admit defeat while he encamped sure of victory. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto, his veterans at the Piedmontese frontier. A brief dream and a false one. Re Marino was surprised, or allowed himself to be surprised. Our right wing was attacked and defeated. We retreated under Novara, threatened with being enveloped and separated from the Alpine metropolis, as we had been from Alessandria and Genoa. And we let ourselves be dragged into one final effort. And it seemed that precisely in those extreme moments of agony, our fortune might miraculously rise again. The weary, tired ranks, already marked by indiscipline, poorly organized and worse dressed, felt that ancient virtue was about to awaken in their hearts and arms. Foot soldiers, knights, gunners, officers and soldiers, under the pale and impassive gaze of the king, led by the Duke of Genoa, mount on his horse with the tip of his sword pointed at the enemy, repelled the formidable Austrian assaults and counter-attacked, repeatedly chasing them away. The pursuit of those who seemed already defeated, requested, implored, and supplicated by the Duke of Genoa might have made Novara a victory for Italy, and perhaps changed, who can say, how the history of our country. It was not granted. The enemy returned to fight. All imperial forces, recalled, arrived on the battlefield. Our generals fell. Gunners died on their guns. Heavy minute, relentless rain sapped the fighters' strength. The air grew dark and grim, and then Ning quickly descended upon the defeated, who, screaming betrayal, abandoned their formations, as did their subordinates, who no longer listened to their leaders' voices. It was darkness, terror, desolation, and fratricidal weapons, greedy hands, and bestial desires raged furiously in the shadows, amidst a chorus of imprecations, terrifying screams, and blasphemies. He was there, on the Novara bastion, waiting without uttering a word, not moving an eyelash for the liberating bullet. He could not kill himself, because he was a Christian. He could die as a soldier by the hand of an unconscious and unknown enemy soldier. And they dragged him away forcibly. He regained consciousness, asked for terms from the victor. They responded with painful and humiliating demands. Immediately he made that sacrifice that, in our grandson's admiration and gratitude, so greatly enhances his figure. Summoned late at night, the sons, generals, Minister Cadorna, those who had been with him, friends in misfortune, in a room of the Pasolacqua Palace, standing near a flickering fire, he said, "To the cause of Italian independence, I have dedicated my entire soul. For it, I wanted to expose myself and my sons' lives to every risk of war. Heaven did not deign to grant me this, and that sublime longed-for goal is forever lost for me. I understand that today my person is an impediment to concluding the peace that has become indispensable, peace that, moreover, I could not sign without dishonor. Not having had the fortune to die on the battlefield, it remains for the sake of my country's health that I lay down this crown that I placed upon the test for the freedom of the fatherland. I am no longer your king, gentlemen. From now on, your king is Vittorio, my son." And motioning the Duke of Savoy to approach him, he laid his right hand on his head and held it for a moment, renewing his vows. Here is the translation, preserving the name Ernesto. It was almost like an ancient rite of consecration, with the severity of fate and the men and the hour making it solemn. Then he embraced his son tightly and for a long time, and he hugged his second son, one by one greeting all those present, upon whom reverence gave way to intense emotion, and tears had no check. The hall was filled with sobs and nothing else. Outside, rain beat relentlessly, and the cries of the wounded and dying continued. He wanted to stay alone with his sons, writing to his wife that he would never see her again, and to his secretary, to the new king. He spoke in brief words, concluding thus: "Above all, you must always remain faithful to your oaths." And he set off towards death. This is how the new reign began. Thus did the reign of a young man start, whom the people and army only knew for his valor on the battlefield. In the imagination of the populace, he was nothing more than the heroic soldier of Saint Lucia and Goito. But fantasies in those times were warped, and faith in defeated soldiers had vanished. They said it impatiently. Someone affirmed it with an awareness of the committed errors. We must blindly obey whoever commands blindly. He would one day exclaim in a fit of anger, and there were those who attributed to him some unheeded good advice. That was not enough. The first people who approached him, expecting orders, dared not utter a word. He immediately wanted to dictate a manifesto to his peoples, and wrote it with his own hand. Our fatal events, the will of the most revered parent, calls me much earlier than scheduled to the throne of my ancestors. The circumstances in which I take up the reins of government are such that, without the most effective contribution from everyone, it would be difficult for me to fulfill my only vow, the salvation of our common homeland. The destinies of nations ripen in God's designs. Man must contribute his whole work to them. We have not failed in this debt. Now our endeavor must be to preserve honor intact and unharmed, to heal the wounds of public fortune, to strengthen constitutional institutions. To this enterprise I implore all my peoples. I am about to take a solemn oath to fulfill it, and I await from the nation help, affection, and trust in return. Then he received news that Marshal Radetzky wanted to confer with him, and he went to meet him on his way to the farm in Vignale. He traveled along a road damaged by the rain, riding ahead of a small group of followers. Seeing pale and scarce peasants, scattered soldiers, a few wounded carriages, and they only greeted him with a cry that was a lament. Peace, peace. He did not respond. He spotted the old Radetzky on horseback. He dismounted readily. Even the marshal wanted to hurry down, but his advanced age and ailments hindered him, and assistance was needed. When he stood next to the king, he wanted to embrace him and reminded him that he loved Queen Maria, Adelaide, with tender paternal affection. Thus the old man, rigid and terrible, became amiable, speaking with a smile of domestic joys, trying to win over the young man's spirit and resorting to subtle seduction. Do you want to be mine, and I will make you powerful? Let us forget that I am a conqueror, and you are. Translation: unconquered. If you listen to me, you will be like a conqueror. And this realm of yours, so often beaten and shattered, will soon flourish and grow strong. Do you seek new dominions? I can give them to you, for now I possess all power. Do you want the protection of my weapons? They are yours. Rebellious subjects, external enemies, nothing can prevail against us as long as we remain united. Renounce this flag imposed upon your father by revolution, and the enemies of your house raise once more the ancient banner that was respected, feared, and glorious, a symbol of honor and victory. Cast aside the treacherous counselors who lost Charles Albert, and return to those who made the early years of his reign so secure and prosperous. No sacrifice is demanded from you, king. Stand with kings. Soldier, stand with soldiers. Listen to an old, experienced man in life and battle. You are young, like my sovereign, destined to know and love one another, bound by blood ties, proximity of territories, and the shared interests of your people's orderly and peaceful future. Austria today knows how to foresee, as it did in the past, and will support the legitimate ambitions of the House of Savoy. Do you not want that? Do you want enemies? Well, I could offer you dignified and tolerable agreements, but remember, you'll stand alone amidst the frenzied passions of political parties, abandoned by us and all Italian princes. I say Italian, all European princes. What has France done for you? Nothing. What will it do? Nothing! Your small throne will sink beneath storms, and if you ask our aid one day, it will be too late. Reflect, sir, this is the hour of your destiny. I have sworn, replied the king courteously but firmly. I have sworn as a prince. I am about to swear as a sovereign. I have fought for Italy, and not a few Italians have fought by my side. I cannot forget them. I must not forget them. I do not wish to betray anyone. I am at the head of an independent state, and that is how I want it to be in the future. I accept the fate of a conqueror, but I make no compromise regarding my duties. I alone am judge of my duties, and I will fulfill them, whatever the cost to me. He came to you, he said, not to forge an alliance, not to acquire lands, not to grow in power, but to conclude a truce. And as the other pressed for answers, the king always refused. He refused, and in his aged face wonder and respect took root, almost sensing that this young man was about to usher in a new chapter of history. The proud figure of the new king, his clear and confident words, that soul laid bare before him so much greater than the misfortune, it seemed to be overwhelmed the instincts of tyranny, victory, the pride of victory, ancient and eternal hatred toward the Italian people. Will met against will, the latter prevailed with more vigor and audacity, the one truly looking to the future, while the other bent beneath the weight of years and deeds. The other curved under the mortal grasp of time. In that interview, Italy was forged, and for the first time, the man Italy had long awaited emerged. It was an instant of true greatness. What a marvel that great things have come from it. A moment of hesitation, logic and humanity, on the other hand, would have lost us. But hesitation was impossible. Victor Ember deliberately met Marshal Radetzky like a king and an Italian had to meet the enemy. A magnificent instinct made him strong, no preparation, no advice, no experience. Every other thing was replaced by the generous voice of blood and love for one's country. He emerged triumphant, and he already thought about the work. He thought, the enemy general understood me, my compatriots will understand me. I bring them the safe flag, the symbol and reality, everything one wants to live and restart. However, almost at the gates of Turin, he met Prince Carlo Alberto di Carignano, who brought him a message from the Queen. The letter spoke of exaltation, exacerbation of spirits, confusion of ideas and purposes, pain for some, humiliation for others, the ire of partisans, greedy desires, all the morbid things rising in the Piedmontese metropolis. The chamber had heard read by Domenico Buffa a letter from Cadorna announcing the disaster and the abdication of Charles Albertre. It voted in an impulsive outburst of sorrowful enthusiasm to erect a national monument to the martyred king. But then it got lost in recriminations, accusations, insults, the most mad and desperate thoughts. Victor, Emanuel immediately went to take the oath of loyalty to the statute, and as he crossed the space between the regal palace and Palazzo Madama, where Parliament had gathered, he saw a large crowd and the city militia armed. Not a single cry did he hear, not a kind face did he notice. Only a few greeted him. Most looked at him without speaking, without moving, cold, suspicious, sorrowful. He entered the hall, climbed onto the throne. Senators and deputies stood up. No one applauded, and it seemed that the welcome always given to sovereigns died on the lips of those sad or enemies. The king took the oath, then spoke brief words, reaffirming his faith in liberal institutions. He said that his oath would encompass all of his life. Deep silence, they did not cheer him on. They did not understand him. He left just as he had entered, with a squeezed heart, and for a moment he almost wept from pain and anger. It seemed very harsh to him while he dedicated his existence to his people and the highest ideals of our time, when he was already able to preserve the flag, the statute, free life, the independence of the kingdom, without being welcomed with open arms, open hearts, surrounded by that trust of all, without which it was impossible to embark on the work, persevere in the work, complete the work. But soon he overcame this. He greeted the lost deputies, Seppi, Montezemolo, Lanza, Ratazzi, and Melana, elected by the chamber to pay him homage. And he freely expressed his deep regret with words full of vivacity and frankness, words meant to disarm the prejudiced, persuade the desperate, inspire courage to answer frankly those who speak frankly. And since they told him that the armistice was creating distrust in Parliament and even worse, and they expressed the desire for the armistice to be revoked, he replied, "Gentlemen deplore all this, and I deplore more than they wish for the tearing up of these agreements and a return to the battlefield, and I desire it even more than them. Just give me 40,000 good soldiers, and tomorrow I will break the armistice and hunt the Austrians in Ticino." As he spoke, his eyes blazed with anger. The deputies left the palace respectfully, amazed by the innocent pride of the young prince, who truly astonished them as an unexpected event, true, more cunning, more ambitious, more astute than others. Urbano Ratazzi perhaps thought of the future prime minister of such a king, and from that day on he devoted himself to that king with deep devotion, first secretly, then openly. But when they returned to Palazzo Carignano, they found themselves caught in the storm raging there. A storm seemed to drag the entire country towards ruin and extremities. Genoa rose up, shouting for a strange and fleeting republic. There were no finances, no army, no sense of civil duty, and the new ministry, formed after the catastrophe, was greeted by the chamber with contempt. And Delaunay, president of the council and general, appeared before the assembly in military attire with his decorations, and the president, amidst laughter, laughing to vent their anger, asked, "Who is this gentleman?" "I am Delaunay, lieutenant general." "Day, very well. And what brings you here in quality of president of the ministers to King Victor Emanuele?" He then turned towards the chamber. "Gentlemen," but the president interrupted, "Ask me for the floor first." New waves of laughter followed. Even worse was when Pier Luigi Pinelli, Minister of the Interior, climbed onto the podium to read the armistice agreements. Death to traitors. Cries erupted from all sides. "No, no, it's cowardice," they shouted. We want a war to the death, a knife fight. Due to these frenzies, the chamber had to be dissolved, a new one convened, and then dissolved again after just a few sittings, which had elected Lorenzo Perito, one of the rebels from Genoa, as its president. But if I have forgotten, the king said, they should not have forgotten. It became necessary to change the prime minister, overcome his reluctance. Resistances from Massimo d'Azeglio convince him, push him, almost force him to take power. And he did, despite being hated by the reactionaries who despised the original and democratic Grand Lord, the artist who charged for his paintings, the novelist, journalist, the wounded man of Vicenza, the Piedmontese who was Lombard in Milan, Tuscan in Florence, Roman in Rome, Italian everywhere, and also by the revolutionaries who knew he was firmly determined not to give an inch to demagoguery, to pursue a conservative politics, to make that peace with Austria without which it would be impossible to close the era of agitation, the period of anarchy into which the state had fallen and which they wanted to continue. Meanwhile, slowly but surely, the truth began to emerge, and a painful event revealed the sentiment of the people, very different from what was being discussed by the men of politics. The king, he spoke so gravely that it became necessary to entrust the administration of public affairs to the Duke of Genoa, and great consternation and pain penetrated the hearts of all. It was sensed that the salvation and fortune of the kingdom were closely linked to the health and life of the king. The thought began to take root among the Piedmontese and other Italians that Vittorio Emanuele was a necessary man. You will be alone. Marshal Radetzky hadn't threatened him, but it was truly this sense of being alone that became the great argument for hope rising towards him. Wherever princes violated the statutes of 1848, submitted to Austrian vassalage, indeed desired and implored it, they were all locked into the renewed customs of a foolish and fearful tyranny, certain, as far as what happened outside Italy went, that the principle of nationalism could not rise again. Yet he stood alone in the position he had chosen, at the head of a small and vanquished people, on an uncertain throne, repeating to all that he had sworn and wanted to keep his oaths, asserting that he was an Italian prince and that his banner was Italian, without shying away from obstacles, but instead facing them vehemently with great loyalty in words and actions, coupled with a firm and unyielding resolve. While this sense of justice seemed to emerge in the opinion of most, it was deemed necessary to perform a final, solemn act to convey the thoughts of the king and provoke an undeniable manifestation from the people. In an unprecedented manner among constitutional regiments, but justified by that reverence and affection that for centuries the Alpine peoples had felt towards the House of Savoy, given the particularly grave condition in which the kingdom still found itself, the external and internal dangers that seemed to threaten and were threatening the monarchy. The king turned to the citizens and asked them, with a loving yet severe word, to perform an act of good and patriotic will. I promise to save the nation from the tyranny of parties, no matter their name, purpose, or rank in men who compose them. This promise, this oath, I fulfill by dissolving an impossible chamber. I fulfill it by immediately convening another one. But if the country, the voters deny me their cooperation, then the responsibility for the future and any potential disturbances will no longer be mine. They will not regret me, but themselves. These words, along with others that seemed of a dark hue, written in the Moncalieri proclamation, deeply moved the already agitated spirits of that time. What was wanted? What was being asked? As we also begin to form a legend around the promote events of our Resurgimento, this legend says that the effect of the Moncalieri proclamation was great and lightning fast. The testimonies that can be gathered affirm the opposite. It was a shock, but there was no immediate victory. Indeed, the victory came when the shock subsided and people began to think little by little. It became understood that this had been a crucial moment. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Ernesto, truly having arrived at the edge of the precipice and realizing that a prompt and that energetic which was necessary. It became evident that the king, while initiating a great conservation movement, was placing the judgment of the people's conduct towards the government and the deliberation regarding the fate of the state back into their consciences. And the people, finally coming to love the king, understood him and responded as they should have. The new chamber arose precisely with the mission of closing the sad history of the past and preparing for the future. They had been saved, and this salvation seemed to be the work of the nation. And it was. But who had guided the nation? Who had chosen the right path at supreme moments of anguish? Who had believed when no one else did? Who had not despaired while everyone else did? Such was the first fortunate and stormy period of a kingdom whose destiny prepared many glories and triumphs, yet it is illuminated by a sad and virile poetry. If, due to great events, the king appeared greater, he was never truly great, as he was in these initial moments of trial and danger, when it was necessary for the young prince to demonstrate all his steadfastness, firmness, and clear understanding of men and things, qualities that come only with years' trials, experiences, and even errors, but which were natural to him, to the fortune of our homeland. From then on, new times began. It was a busy, joyful, fortunate vigil, nor does history know up to this point any period comparable to it. Even remotely, the small kingdom advanced from one audacity to another. Powerful intellects emerged in the state, bold souls prepared and accomplished marvelous feats. The subalpine king and the subalpine parliament became objects of growing attention and admiration throughout Europe. Everyone awaited, feared, and hoped for a speech from the crown, the words spoken by Massimo Aziglio or Camillo di Cava on the tribune sparked debates in the press, discussions in other assemblies, diplomatic maneuvers, court intrigues, people's demonstrations, notes, protests, praises, hymns, enthusiasm, criticism, rancor and fear, the duel between the Piedmontese state, which assumed the right to speak on behalf of Italy before all peoples, and powerful Austria, proud of its victories and meticulously organized as a tool for threat and repression, became the most dramatic and beautiful spectacle ever presented on the world stage. A formidable match, formidable because the forces were vastly disproportionate every turn. One of the opponents seemed ready to crumble against the other to destroy it, while that which appeared weaker never yielded, but provoked, offended, and struck back. It seemed that Piedmont grew stronger and bolder at every moment in the heat of battle. A poetic and youthful aura enveloped all politics. There were vibrant words, virile acts, promises and smiles. Summarizing the images of that time, you will see nothing but a joyful swaying of flags in the wind, beneath which the people united, ready to defend their rights, their freedom, and their independence. The sun shines, and you will only hear applause and frenzied cheers of joy, while in the profound silences of other Italian regions, all turn quietly hoping towards the royal palace in Turin, greeting and waiting. First among them is the king, the popular king, the hunting king, the soldier king, the young and robust king who descends amongst the crowd, speaks and jokes in his native dialect, climbs the steep peaks of his homeland, becomes the idol of shepherds and farmers, just as he is the idol of soldiers and workers. He reigns on the throne, sometimes severe, sometimes terrifying, and his outraged gaze cannot be endured, yet more often with the kindness and frankness of his manner and speech. He wins hearts, persuades consciences, overcomes obstacles, smooths difficulties, breaks delays, does whatever he pleases. The minister he loves, whom he makes a friend and companion, is Massimo d'Azeglio. "Hello, Massimo," he says or writes to him. He had him by his side during the critical days of the initial trials, and he would always like to have him by his side. Chivalrous, witty, experienced in life, scornful of everything vulgar, scornful and how, of money, gallant with ladies, a soldier's soul, who takes charge of the armed force, dressed as a cavalry colonel to suppress a turbulent demonstration. He sees Camillo di Cava arise and warns his friend, the wicked rival, as d'Azeglio will later call him, knocks on the door. "Is not your time?" says the king. It will come when Azeglio proposes him to him with the consent of the other ministers as Minister of Agriculture and Commerce. The king tells his advisers, "Since they want this man, I have no difficulty in naming him, but he will send all of you away." He parts with regret and much reluctance from d'Azeglio, who had baptized him the gallant king. Massimo said one day, "There have been so few gallant kings in history that it would be really nice to start a series." The king? Am I supposed to be the gallant king? And Massimo adds, "Your Majesty has sworn fidelity to the statute. You have thought of Italy, not Piedmont. Let us continue on this path, and keep firmly in mind that in this world, whether it is a king or an obscure individual, they only have one word, and that must be heeded." The king thinks for a moment, then resolutely says, "Well, the job seems easy to me." And Massimo happily affirms, "Way, have the gallant king." But Camillo di Cava, aided by a certain indolence, a certain aristocratic skepticism that governed, especially in Azeglio's, had the everyday matters, had become everything from Minister of Agriculture and Commerce to Minister of Finance. He effectively held the presidency of the council, while d'Azeglio spoke rarely and with bad will and rarely rushed to a prompt solution for a debate. Cava was always on the spot and on every issue anticipated the political aspect, and above all issues expressed what others believed to be the cabinet's thinking. But in reality it was his own thinking. Only his colleagues listened to him at first in wonder, then with embarrassment, and finally they dared not rebel and accepted everything. This possessed spirit, tireless, took care of all political combinations, all parliamentary needs, trying as long as he could to proceed in harmony with the other ministers, but often acting on his own, with a freedom and ease that made him the most sympathetic yet more inconvenient colleague in the world. His hour was truly approaching. Indeed, it had already struck, and the king realized in time that this man was necessary to him, to Piedmont, to Italy. He preserved his unwavering trust until the armistice of Villafranca. Camillo di Cava surrounded the king with profound respect, and even though he was as great as he was, he preferred to appear inspired rather than the inspirer, and in this, like everything else, he succeeded. Of course, there were times when his passionate temperament took over, and words flowed swiftly, and he would agitate and fret, being utterly distracted from anything, even some elementary etiquette rules. But under the king's fierce and burning gaze, he would immediately regain control and remember that the king was the fundamental condition of his policy. and what the king truly represented became evident in the struggles between the state and the church, which sometimes reached an acute level almost incomprehensible to us. The Vatican court did not want to tolerate in Piedmont what it calmly accepted in all other civil states. They did not wish to hear about the abolition of the ecclesiastical forum, civil marriage, or the suppression of religious corporations. The Christian conscience of the king suffered fierce assaults. Confessors and prelates schemed in the shadows. Excommunications were threatened, and pious queens supplicated. My mother and my wife, wrote the king, make me say they are dying of sorrow because of you understand what pleasure that gives me. And they died within a few days of each other, as did the Duke of Genoa, the strong captain who seemed predestined to lead us to victory. How many of us who have loved and suffered can comprehend the greatness of spirit needed to withstand such terrible and repeated blows of fate and triumph over them, while liars claimed they were God's punishments? But Vittorio Emanuele had a different God, a God of justice and truth, whose decrees he revered, always listening to the austere voice of duty that spoke to him in his heart. Once again he won, this time as well, and with him was victorious Camillo da Cava, the inspirer and author of the great national and liberal policy that so elevated Piedmont before Europe. Then came the days of Crimea, military victories, martial heroisms, and for the first time Italy's cause was openly supported against the representatives of world powers, against the representative of Austria. Through the words of the great minister, we had an army, an administration, a diplomacy, industries and trade flourished. Giant projects began, such as the Sinisio Tunnel and the Spezia Arsenal. War with Austria was prepared and obtained through the French alliance. The king announced, "Do not be insensitive to the cry of pain that rings out from every part of Italy towards him." And when the hour is about to strike, Napoleon retracts from his promises due to the evil influence courtiers and his natural and almost morbid uncertainty of spirit. He proclaims that he will do as his father did, renounce the crown and become simply Mons Savoia Misrere Savoy and embrace republicanism. Finally, Austria makes the hoped-for mistake, provoking us after long provocation in turn. Field Marshal Dulé, the supreme commander of the Austrian army in Italy, sends his militias an order of the day which reads, "The Emperor has called you to arms so that for the third time we may lower the banner of Piedmont and uproot the fanatics who disturb the general peace of Europe." The king writes to Cava, "Dear Cava, the order of the day is a true declaration of war. I believe that there will be no more talks. I am filled with anger. Please send in my name a coded dispatch to Prince Napoleon like this. I communicate to you the order given by the Emperor. The Austrian army make the appropriate reflections. Dear Cava, write to me something. I would like to fire cannonballs tonight. The Austrian envoys arrive in Turin with the ultimatum. The chamber meets for an extraordinary session. Cava proposes granting the king full powers. With a surge noted in the official report, but which we can sense even after many years, we feel all the power and emotion of the immortal man as he exclaims, "And who could be a better guardian of our freedom? Who is more worthy of this trust from the nation? He whose name for 10 years of rule became synonymous with loyalty and honor, he who always kept high and firm the Italian tricolor flag, he who now prepares to fight for liberty and independence, leaving the Carignano Palace through the crowd frenetically shouting, 'Long live the king!' he said. I leave the last session of the last Piedmontese chamber. The next will be that of the chamber of the Kingdom of Italy. The king returned to soldiering, and they saw him charge into the Austrian ranks at Palestro, in vain held back by French Zouaves, and lead our infantry at San Martino in the final battle. Everything seemed lost at Villafranca. Cava retreated, filled with indignation and bitterness, but he stayed put, trusting in the star that his ancestors had waited for, and that his father had greeted among martyrs and hopes. Then triumphant cities of the peninsula saw him: Milan, Parma, Modena, and this glorious Florence, as well as immense Naples and radiant Palermo. While waiting for Venice and Rome, a promise of destiny, the Italian Parliament proclaimed him King of Italy. This, I will say again, is so far the most beautiful chapter in our history. Nothing was lacking to us, neither the genius of statesmen, nor the virtue of warriors, nor civil wisdom, nor the wonderful concord, nor the swift, unexpected, glorious triumph. Vincenzo Gioberti had foreseen it in his stunning pages of Rinnovamento Renewal. Daniel Manin understood it while converted, as fate promised, waiting for Venice and Rome, when the Italian Parliament proclaimed him King of Italy. Here is the translation while preserving the name Ernesto. In the national monarchy, this had been intuited by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who raised the cry, Italy and Vittorio Emanuele, with which the country was reconstituted. It was a great chapter, and in front of this, others appear, either pale or bad. All the energies that Italy had accumulated over centuries of suffering suddenly burst forth, and a new Italy emerged, one that no one knew. But the entire chapter would remain unexplained were it not for the protagonist, the hero who understood, willed, hoped for all, suffered for all, and won for all. Other great princes founded states. He founded a nation. Here lies the word of his glory. Here is why this glory is immortal. Noti 1. Napoleon is Campaigns in Italy, 1859, compiled at the War Archives from official documents while serving as Director General Blondel. Paris, Imperial Printing House, 1863. Index Federation and Unity, P5, The Heroes of the Revolution, 41, From the 10 Days of Brescia to the Battle of San Martino, 75, The Kindly King, Anno 5, Transcriber's Note. Original orthography and punctuation have been retained, correcting minor typographical errors without annotation. Index Federation and Unity, P5, The Heroes of the Revolution, 41, From the 10 Days of Brescia to the Battle of San Martino, 75, The Kindly King, Anno 5, Transcriber's Note. Original orthography and punctuation have been retained, correcting minor typographical errors without annotation.